Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku became a YouTube sensation part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content. And leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends, and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story RewriteTheUniverse from 𝐬𝐻3. So let's start the video. Guys, Denki came bursting into the homeroom class of Class 3 with a shout, slamming the door open and earning a reproachful glare from it. Katsuki rolled his eyes. It was too early for Denki's nonsense. Don't get him wrong, Katsuki loved his friends. It had taken a lot of time and patience on the part of said friends to get Katsuki to admit that to himself, let alone them, but it was true. Over the past 2 years at UA, he'd gone through a lot. He'd faced down real villains head-on. He'd gotten a little carried away in the Sports Fest finale his first year, and he'd been kidnapped by villains who had become convinced that Katsuki fucking Bakugo would ever want to join them. All these things had forced him to take a hard look at himself and examine some of his own flaws. Honestly, half the battle had just been getting him to admit to himself that he had flaws. His therapist was a champ just for putting up with him, but his friends had been there for him the whole way, supporting him at every step. Katsuki had spent many nights in 𝐬𝐻3's room venting out his own thoughts, fears, frustrations, and regrets. In fact, all of his squad knew a lot about him, but no one knew better than 𝐬𝐻3 the fucked up kid that Katsuki had once been. Well, no one but Deku maybe, but Katsuki hadn't seen or spoken to Deku since they'd gone to different schools after middle school. Wait, how did Katsuki get off on this mental tangent? Sorry 𝐬𝐻3, I promise I'll respect our school property in the future, Denki recited almost mechanically, but it seemed enough to placate the class president. Oh right, Katsuki was thinking that he loved his friends, but that didn't mean he always had the patience to deal with them, and right now he definitely was too tired to deal with whatever bullshit Denki had dragged in with him this morning. Guys, you've got to see this video. This kid is amazing, Denki shouted towards the assembling Baku squad. What is it, Denks? Mina questioned as she sidled up next to him to look at his phone, which he'd propped up at the edge of his desk so that people could gather around him to watch. It's this kid. He looks maybe our age, but he wears a mask, so I don't know. But his voice, it's amazing. He's the greatest singer I've probably ever heard, Denki explained with so much enthusiasm. Katsuki was briefly worried the idiot might accidentally activate his quirk and zap the whole class. Katsuki, you gotta come see this. He's so good, Denki urged. Fuck off, Pikachu. I don't give a fuck about some nerd's singing voice, Katsuki grumbled, but without any venom behind it. Whatever, just at least listen then, Denki shouted as he hit play. Several of their classmates even outside the squad had gathered around to watch, drawn in by the electric blonde's enthusiasm. Despite his grumpiness, Katsuki did listen in on whatever the video was. At first, he didn't hear much of anything, besides a few mutters from classmates commenting on whatever mask the kid in the video was wearing. He thought he heard someone mutter rabbit ears. He heard the sounds of shuffling and scratching, like someone was adjusting a live mic, which was probably exactly what was happening. Then there was a soft clearing of the throat, a few bars of a piano intro, and suddenly Katsuki was listening to the most beautiful voice he'd heard in his entire life. Have you ever felt like nobody was there? Have you ever felt forgotten in the middle of nowhere? Have you ever felt like you could disappear? Like you could fall and no one would hear? Well, let that lonely feeling wash away. Maybe there's a reason to believe you'll be okay, cause when you don't feel strong enough to stand, you can reach out your hand and someone will come running, and I know they'll take you home even when the dark comes crashing through, when you need a friend to carry you, and when you're broken on the ground. You will be found, so let the sun come streaming, and cause you'll reach up and you'll rise again. Lift your head and look around. You will be found, you will be found, you will be found, you will be found, you will be found. As the song and the video ended, the classroom was filled with a stunned silence. It took several moments for Katsuki to realize a tear had run down his cheek as he listened. He surreptitiously wiped the tear away as he heard several sniffs and shuffles among the gathered students, realizing that several other classmates had had a similar reaction. Wow, he's amazing. Uraraka was the first to break the silence, sniffing slightly as she wiped her eyes clear with her sleeve. But why does he call himself that? It's like he doesn't even know how good he is. What do you mean? What's his name? Jiro asked. She was sitting at her desk, but was unable to see the screen from where she was sitting, her view blocked by others gathered at Denki's desk. I don't know, but his username is Deku. Does he really think he's useless? Uraraka responded. Katsuki froze. No way. There was no way. It had to be a coincidence, right? Katsuki shook himself from his stupor and forced his way through the gathered students over to Denki's desk. Only one way to find out. Katsuki snatched up the phone, ignoring Denki's shouted protests, and stared at the screen. For the second time in a short period, 𝐀𝐦 felt himself freeze, his eyes widening in surprise. The video had reverted to its thumbnail, which was a boy about their age, the singer, sitting in a chair in what looked like a bedroom. He had a cheap but decent quality USB mic set up in front of him, and he was wearing a baggy gray hoodie that covered his hair paired with a cheap plastic rabbit mask that covered the upper half of his face. But 𝐀𝐦 knew. He recognized the freckles that peeked out from under the mask. He recognized the eyes of deep emerald green that were visible through the mask's eye holes. The All Might merch plastered all over the room behind him, and the Deku username were the final nails in the coffin. There was no one else this could be but the Deku he knew. But since when could the nerd sing like that? Come to think of it, 𝐀𝐦 didn't think he'd ever heard Deku sing at all, even when they were kids. He quickly recovered his composure and dropped the phone on the desk, returning back to his own seat. What the hell was that blasty? Mina chided. ch. Nothing. Just wanted to see what kind of nerd would use the name Deku. 𝐀𝐦 covered. It wasn't exactly a lie, but he definitely didn't want to let them know that he knew Deku, especially not with the history between them. Only 𝐸 knew anything about it, and even then only in vague and abstract terms. Mina and several others gave him a look that said they didn't totally buy it, but they let it drop. Maybe he doesn't use it to mean useless, 𝐸𝐻𝐻 suddenly offered, shifting the conversation away from 𝐀𝐦's weird moment. I mean, it kinda sounds like you can do it, right? Maybe it's like a motivational thing. 𝐀𝐦 quietly scoffed, but kept his mouth shut. That definitely hadn't been his intention when he'd assigned the name to the nerd, to Deku, but it didn't matter. Who knows, maybe Deku really was using it like 𝐸𝐻𝐻 suggested. What was that turn of phrase? Something about turning bullshit into fertilizer. He'd certainly provided enough bullshit to last Deku a lifetime. 𝐀𝐦 could only hope that wherever the nerd was, he wasn't around people like 𝐀𝐦 anymore. The rest of the school day passed by in a blur. 𝐀𝐦 took what notes he could, but he found it hard to focus. All he could think about was Deku. With just a few minutes of song, the nerd had managed to worm his way into 𝐀𝐦's brain and he couldn't get him out. That video was the first time he'd seen Deku since their last day of middle school. He hadn't even bothered to say anything to him on the occasion, because he had still been an asshole back then. Congratulations on UA, Kaken. I know you'll do great, Deku had timidly said as they were packing to leave. 𝐀𝐦 hadn't said anything. He'd just made a TCH sound, then sneered and walked off to go to the arcade with his friends who he hadn't spoken a single word to since starting UA. That video wasn't, however, the last time he'd tried to see Deku since then. In the middle of their second year, 𝐀𝐦 had finally been through enough therapy and spent enough time with his friends that he'd realized that, more than anything, he owed Deku an apology. He hadn't expected to be forgiven, really. He certainly wouldn't have forgiven himself. Not for all the shit he'd put Deku through, but that didn't matter. Deku was owed an apology, but he hadn't been able to give it. He went to where he remembered that Deku and his mom lived, only to find an empty apartment, the nameplate removed from the door. He found out from his own mom later that the Midoriyas had moved away to be closer to Deku's school, but she didn't know where that was. So he'd never been able to give that apology and had made peace with the fact that he may never get a chance to. But now Deku was back. Figuratively speaking, of course. He had a YouTube channel, but it was something, and he was good, like really good. 𝐀𝐦 had never heard a voice so beautiful in his entire life. Finally, the last bell rang to dismiss them for the day, and he immediately threw his things in his bag and made a beeline for his dorm room. He slammed the door shut, locked it, and tossed his bag in the corner before flopping down on his bed and grabbing his laptop and his headphones. He didn't want the rest of the class to know what he was about to do. He searched up Deku's YouTube channel and found it almost immediately. He had quite the following. Nothing to reach massive levels of internet fame, but still a respectable few thousand subscribers. He also discovered that the video Denki had shown them was one of Deku's first, from about a year ago. He'd since posted several more and had upped his setup. Instead of sitting at a desk in what was probably his bedroom and using a cheap USB mic, he now had a dedicated recording area with sound-absorbing foam panels in the background and a decent quality mic on a mic stand. Nothing like a professional recording studio, but it would do a lot to improve the overall sound quality. He also upped the disguise a bit. He was still wearing a hoodie and mask like in the other video, but the hoodie was cleaner and fit him slightly better, and instead of a drab gray it was now a deep forest green to match his eyes. The mask looked custom made now too. 𝐀𝐦 couldn't tell the material, but it was glossy and well made. It still had the general shape of a rabbit, but had a gold engraving on it in a flowery abstract design. It was very pretty. 𝐀𝐦 spent the next few hours watching every video the nerd had ever uploaded, and each one impressed him just as much as the first. And the nerd had a wide variety. He sang pop songs, rock songs, ballads, Japanese songs, American songs, songs from musicals, modern songs, classic songs. He was all over the map with his musical genres, and every single one of them sounded amazing. By the end of the night, Katsuki had watched every video at least twice. In most of the early videos, Deku didn't say anything, just started the video, sang his song, and then ended the video. But in some of the more recent ones, he started giving an outro to each video, explaining why he chose to sing a particular song. Usually, it was just something that suited his mood for the day, or something that he felt had particular meaning to him. It was jarring when he heard Deku speak for the first time in one of the videos. He hadn't heard the nerd's speaking voice in several years, and he'd almost forgotten it. Listening to it now, he could easily detect the almost song-like quality to Deku's voice. He had no idea how he hadn't heard it before, how he hadn't realized that Deku would be an amazing singer. It seemed so obvious now, just listening to him speak. Katsuki had his cursor halfway to the subscribe button when he paused. His YouTube account was under his hero name and the picture was himself in hero costume. There was very little chance that Deku would ever see him among his several thousand subscribers, but he still didn't want to take the risk. So he quickly made up a dummy YouTube account and debated for a bit before naming it 𝐀𝐦0715, the initials of his first choice of hero name and the date of Deku's birthday. And he set the profile picture to be a photo he'd taken during class once of All Might in his Silver Age outfit. He figured Deku would appreciate that if he ever happened to see the profile. He hit subscribe and set it up to alert his phone whenever Deku uploaded a new video. Realizing that he hadn't done any of his homework, he silently cursed himself and resolved to do it in the morning. Before rolling over and going to sleep, Deku's singing playing on loop in his head as he gently drifted off. Izuku Midoriya was pretty sure he'd never felt more nervous in his entire life. Today was his first day at Shiksu High School. His dream growing up had always been to join the hero course at UA High School, but after everything that happened with the sludge villain and what All Might told him on that rooftop months ago, well, let's just say he'd let that dream rest for the first time since he'd learned what a hero was. Speaking of the sludge villain, Izuku had heard later that day about how it had gotten hold of Kaken too. Izuku felt terrible, seeing as it was likely his fault that the villain had gotten away from All Might in the first place. He was just glad that All Might had been there to step in at the last minute to save Kaken. He hadn't been able to bring himself to say anything to the explosive blonde after that, but he'd wished he could have apologized or something without having his face exploded. As it was, he didn't say anything at all to Kaken until their final day of middle school. He'd heard, of course, that Kaken had gotten into UA's hero course. Of course he had, it was Kaken. There was no greater potential hero than Kaken, so it was no surprise at all that the country's greatest hero school would accept him. Izuku had offered Kaken his congratulations, hoping in some small corner of his mind that they could have one last friendly conversation before parting ways, most likely forever, something akin to how they'd been as children. But alas, Kaken had merely scoffed at him and walked away without saying anything. Izuku hadn't really been surprised, though maybe he was just a little sad. But he had to move forward. After the conversation with All Might, Izuku had made the decision not to even apply at UA. He wasn't going to be a hero. It was something he'd come to terms with. There were many nights of crying himself to sleep involved, but he was at peace with it. Mostly, he'd considered going for UA's general education course still. After all, he was an exceptional student and would likely do very well on their entrance exams. But he somehow knew that if Kaken found out that Izuku had followed him to UA, it would just ignite fresh rounds of bullying from the blonde. And so Izuku had decided to look elsewhere. Ultimately, after much research and discussion with his mom, he decided to apply for the general education course at the school known as the UA of the West, Shiksu High. As he'd predicted would happen with UA, Izuku aced the entrance exam, achieving the highest score among all the applicants. So here he was, standing outside the gates to Shiksu High, wearing the navy and red uniform, the hat emblazoned with the Shiksu logo sitting awkwardly atop his green curls. As mentioned before, he was pretty sure he'd never been more nervous. He was also pretty sure he'd never felt more lonely. He and his mother had moved across the country to be closer to the school, and he didn't know anyone here. He hadn't exactly had a lot of friends back in his hometown, either, but there was something about at least knowing the people around you that was comforting in a weird way, even if they were indifferent to you at best and bullied you at worst. And in some strange way, knowing that Kaken was always around, even if he didn't want anything to do with Izuku, always made him feel better. The blonde had once been his best friend and Izuku had always looked up to him. He never stopped either, not even when their relationship turned sour after Izuku was diagnosed as quirkless. But now he was alone. No friends, no family besides his mom, no Kaken. Taking a deep breath and shutting his eyes for a moment, Izuku steeled himself. Come on, Izuku, he thought to himself. You knew this was going to happen. This is what we chose. Now get your feet moving and get in there. Hey, you know you're, like, talking to yourself, right? It's kinda strange. Izuku's eyes snapped open and looked at the voice, seeing a slightly older girl with fawn-colored hair and brown eyes looking at him curiously. She was dressed in the Shiksu uniform, so she must be a student, maybe a second year. Wait, had Izuku been talking out loud that whole time? Yeah, you totally were. It was, like, totally weird. Are you okay? The girl asked. Izuku immediately began flailing his arms in front of himself, causing the girl to lean back in surprise as Izuku stammered out an apology. Oh, I'm sorry. It's just a bad habit of mine. I tend to ramble to myself without realizing. Everything's okay, though, promise. She seemed to consider him for a moment, placing a single finger to her chin and tilting her head slightly, before snapping back to her bubbly disposition. Okay, if you say so. And as far as what little I heard you say, don't be nervous. I mean, you got into 𝐬𝐸, right? So just do your best, okay? And with that she turned and skipped away towards the school, leaving Izuku dumbfounded. Holy whoa, Izuku thought, this time making sure he wasn't speaking out loud. I talked to a girl. Suddenly the 5-minute warning bell sounded, shaking him from his thoughts and causing him to rush in towards the school. The first part of the school day had gone by without much fanfare. He found his classroom, met his homeroom teacher and a few of his classmates, and went to the first day orientation assembly. Of course, when he said he met some of his classmates, what he really meant was he overheard them meeting each other and learned a few of their names and quirks. Izuku himself hadn't worked up the courage to talk to anyone, and no one else had bothered to reach out to the quiet, awkward kid mumbling to himself at his desk. He was honestly kicking himself for not getting that bubbly girl's name. She had been nice and reached out to him, but she'd skipped off before he could shake off his stupor and introduce himself. She could have been his first friend. Oh well, there was nothing to be done about it now. Maybe he'd meet her again later or something. For now, he had a new opportunity to make a friend. They announced during the orientation that there was a program the school ran where first-year students could sign up to be randomly assigned a mentor of sorts from among the upperclassmen. Izuku immediately worked his way up to the sign-up sheet as soon as the assembly was dismissed. It was a little pathetic, honestly. But if he was assigned a mentor, then that person would be forced to talk to Izuku, which would give him a chance to make a good impression and make a friend. At least he really hoped that was how it would go. The rest of the day finished up, again without anything noteworthy happening. He still hadn't managed to talk to anyone besides the girl from this morning, and the mentors weren't going to be assigned until the following day. But he was still optimistic. It wasn't exactly like he'd made a bad first impression, more like he hadn't made an impression at all. Okay, it sounded pretty sad when you phrased it like that, but at least it meant he still had a chance to make a good first impression to his classmates and make some friends. For now, though, he was headed home. Or to his new home anyway. His mom had been incredibly accommodating when he'd been accepted into 𝐬𝐸. She'd immediately set about transferring her job to a new location closer to the school, and they'd gone apartment hunting on the weekends before finding a nice, modest place that was a short train ride from the school gates. And it was to this apartment that Izuku returned that afternoon to the most delightful smell he could imagine. Mom, I'm home, Izuku shouted. Izuku, honey, his mother replied, stepping out of the kitchen. Welcome home. My baby's first day at 𝐬𝐸. I'm so proud of you. Did you have a good first day? Yeah, it was great. Izuku stretched the truth slightly. It certainly wasn't a bad first day, but it definitely could have gone better. The teachers are really nice, and my classmates seem really cool. His mother gave him a knowing look. Did you talk to any of them, though? Izuku rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, knocking his cap askew. No, not exactly. There was one girl at the start of the day, though. We talked a little. I forgot to get her name or introduce myself, though. She gave him a soft look and removed his hat so she could rub his hair fondly. Oh, sweetie, that's okay. You'll do better tomorrow. I'm still so proud of you. Now, come on. I made you katsudon for dinner to celebrate your first day. Yeah, thanks, Mom. Izuku really was amazingly lucky to have his mother. And she was right. He would do better tomorrow. He just had to have confidence, right? Later that night, as he lay in bed trying to sleep, his mind wandered to 𝐀𝐦. He wondered how the blonde's first day of school in a hero course had gone. 𝐀𝐦 was nothing if not confident, so Izuku was sure he'd been amazing, just like he always had been. He fell asleep a little while later, his mind focused on trying to be just a little more like 𝐀𝐦 tomorrow, confident enough to make at least one friend. Izuku was nervous again. His nervousness and anxiety were so prevalent that sometimes he wondered if that doctor had been wrong. Maybe he did have a quirk after all. A terrible quirk that just made him feel nervous at the drop of a hat. But no, he just had to face that this was how he was. Quirkless and nervous. If he ever became famous one day, he could use that as a subtitle for his autobiography. Quirkless and nervous, the Deku story. He actually managed to giggle a bit at himself for that, and he tried not to think about the source of his erstwhile nickname that he hadn't heard since moving away from 𝐬𝐸. he managed to bring himself back to the present, which unfortunately meant back to his nervousness. The morning classes had gone by just fine, though he still hadn't managed to actually talk to anyone outside of answering questions when called on by teachers. Now, it was lunch break, which meant it was time to meet his assigned mentor. He really wanted this to go well, because it kind of felt like his only chance to start making friends. If someone wasn't forced to talk to him, he wasn't sure if he would ever step up and do it himself. He was in a corner of the cafeteria, gathered with a handful of other first years who had signed up for the mentorship program. They had been told to wait there and the mentors would come collect them as their classes let out. While he was waiting, shifting nervously from foot to foot, he felt a looming presence behind him, accompanied by a large shadow suddenly being cast over his diminutive form. "Hi there," a rather loud and boisterous voice called out from above him. Izuku turned around and immediately had to crane his neck to look up at the beast of a high schooler standing before him. The boy was in the standard 𝐬𝐻𝐬 uniform, just like he was, but he towered above him, a good several feet taller than Izuku. His hair was shorn down quite short, to the point he could almost look bald under the hat he was wearing. In the back of his mind, Izuku could already hear Kaken calling him Baldy. "Oh, hi, are you my mentor?" Izuku asked timidly. "Who, me? Nope, I'm a first year just like you. I'm waiting for my own mentor. I just wanted to introduce myself to everyone and we haven't met yet. I'm Urashi." The large boy stuck his massive hand out to shake. Izuku reached out and gripped the hand as best he could, despite it dwarfing his own by comparison. "And nice to meet you. My name's Midoriya." "It's great to meet you, Midoriya." Urashi gave his hand a good friendly squeeze and then released it. Izuku tried not to show how much that squeeze had actually hurt due to Izuku's lack of endurance. "So what course are you in? I haven't seen you in any of my classes." "Oh, I'm in the general education course. What about you?" Izuku replied. He was actually finding it surprisingly easy to talk to Urashi as the conversation progressed. He was so used to people cutting him off or yelling at him, but Urashi was just politely and intensely listening before responding. "Oh, general education. I heard the entrance exam for that can be really difficult, so you must be crazy smart." "I'm in the hero course myself," Urashi responded boisterously. Izuku couldn't help himself. Even though he'd given up on his own dreams of being a hero, old habits die hard and his hero worship brain kicked in. "Wow, really? That's so cool. 𝐬𝐻𝐬's hero course is really hard to get into, so you must have an awesome quirk." "Nothing outwardly visible, so an emitter type maybe. I could guess some kind of strength enhancer based on your size, but something tells me that's not quite right." "Whoa, you really just go off there," Urashi politely interrupted before Izuku could get in too deep. "And I can definitely see how you got into Gen Ed. You really are smart. I do have an emitter type quirk, but you're right, it isn't a strength quirk. My quirk is called Whirlwind." Urashi did a sweep of his hand and suddenly the air currents around Izuku started to kick up and he felt his entire body lift about a foot of the ground before being gently let back down. "Wow, that's so cool." Izuku whipped one of his notebooks from his bag and began jotting down notes. "How precisely can you control things? Is there a range limit? What about a weight limit for things you can move? Can you shape the wind into specific forms?" Izuku stopped himself this time when he looked up and saw the shocked look on Urashi's face. "Oh, sorry. I just really like studying quirks. I get a little carried away sometimes." He rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly, again knocking his hat askew. Urashi, to his credit, recovered quickly. "No, not at all. I was just surprised. I didn't even tell you the details of how my quirk worked and you immediately figured out the most pertinent details and started asking questions that it took me years to think to ask myself." "It's impressive, Midoriya." Izuku was shocked. No one had ever complimented his analytical skills. At best, they'd ignore him, but usually they'd call him weird or creepy or yell at him to shut up. "Thank you," was all he could manage to get out. "Of course," Urashi said brightly. "So what about you? What's your quirk?" "Oh, of course." Izuku always forgot that this question always came whenever he geeked out about other people's quirks. Well, he'd almost made a friend. Time to rip off the band-aid and get either pity or derision. That was all he ever got when he told people. I am quirkless, actually." Izuku looked down towards the floor as he answered softly, mentally bracing himself for whatever response was coming. "Oh, well, that's okay. Not like you really need one with that brain of yours, right?" Izuku's head snapped up in shock. He'd received all kinds of responses when he told people he was quirkless, but never this. Never a casual dismissal of the necessity of having a quirk at all paired with a compliment of Izuku's other qualities. "Why you don't pity me or get disgusted by me?" Izuku asked, barely managing not to cry. "What? No, never." Urashi looked horrified at the suggestion. "Why would I do any of that? I can already tell you're way smarter than me, and I can tell you're an honest person, Midoriya. Why should I care that you don't have a quirk?" Izuku couldn't help it. Tears started to fall down his cheeks. He tried to rub them away quickly, but Urashi had definitely seen them. "Oh God, I'm so sorry. Please don't cry." Urashi shouted as he bowed so deeply and with such force that he slammed his head into the tile floor. Izuku was surprised the floor hadn't cracked. He was a little worried Urashi's skull might have cracked instead. Izuku quickly sniffed and collected himself, wiping the last tears away. No, it's okay. You didn't make me cry. It's just no one has ever been that nice about my being quirkless. Please, it's okay. Are you alright, though? You hit the ground pretty hard. To his relief, Urashi straightened himself back up and seemed to be uninjured. Oh, well, I'm glad I didn't upset you. Inosuke Urashi, a voice called out from the side. Both boys turned to look, and Izuku was shocked to see someone who was covered from head to toe in hair, all of which seemed to be coming off of his head. It must be his quirk. Here I am, Urashi called. Ah, perfect. I'm Nagamasa, I'll be your mentor. Let's go. Nagamasa replied. Right away, sir. Urashi replied with soldier-like intensity, before turning to give Izuku a quick acknowledgement. It was nice to meet you, Midoriya. I'll see you around. And with that, he was gone and Izuku was by himself again. Looking around, he found that at this point almost every one of the other first years had been collected by their assigned mentor. Izuku was starting to panic a little. Did he get bad luck and just didn't get a mentor and they hadn't bothered to tell him? Had his mentor shown up, looked at him and decided he wasn't worth their time? Oh, so are you Midoriya, then? A slightly familiar and bubbly voice sounded behind him. Izuku spun around quickly and came face to face with the same girl from yesterday who had talked to him at the entrance gate. Why yeah, that's me. Izuku am Midoriya. Izuku stammered as he stiffly held his hand out to shake. Cool. She gave his hand a sideways high five rather than shake it. I'm like your mentor, I guess. 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐶𝐭. Izuku stared at his hand in confusion for a moment before refocusing. Oh, awesome. It's nice to meet you, 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐴-senpai. You, gross. She gave a disgusted face for a moment. You don't have to call me that. Just call me 𝐀𝐦, it's what I prefer. Oh, a girl was telling him to call her by her first name. Wow, well, then you can call me Izuku. It's only fair, right? Yeah, sure. 𝐀𝐦 replied casually as she turned and started walking towards a lunch table, beckoning Izuku to follow. You're kind of a weird kid. Izuku. Izuku's head dropped a little. Yeah, I know nah, but it's cool though. 𝐀𝐦 cut off his depressive spiral before it could go too far. I prefer being friends with weirdos, anyway. I'm pretty weird myself, if you hadn't noticed. 𝐀𝐦 led them over to an empty lunch table and they both sat down, pulling out their respective bentos. They spent the rest of the lunch period just chatting and getting to know each other. They talked about the school and what kind of things Izuku should expect out of his first year. They talked about academics and their various strengths and weaknesses in it. They talked about Izuku's hometown and how he'd moved so far just to come here. He'd mentioned that he hadn't had very many friends back home, but he was really eager to try and make new friends here. Izuku learned she was in the hero course and he learned about her illusion-based quirk. She learned about his quirklessness and reacted rather similarly to Urashi. Why would I care if you're quirkless? You're like, totally adorable and super smart. Honestly, from the sound of things. Don't be surprised if I start bugging you to help me study. 𝐀𝐦 said. That guy Urashi said more or less the same thing. It's just so weird. I'm so used to people looking down on me or pitying me when they find out. Izuku sheepishly replied. Well, that's dumb. Anybody here gives you shit like that, just let me know. Your big sis 𝐀𝐦 will beat the shit out of him. She made an overt flexing pose, despite not being all that muscular. Izuku smiled anyway. Thanks, 𝐀𝐦. When the bell rang to end lunch, Izuku waved goodbye to his mentor and moved off towards his afternoon class happier than he'd been in a long time. That happiness didn't last long though. He was approaching his homeroom and was about to push the slightly ajar door all the way open, when he paused, hearing voices inside that caught his attention. What's up with that green-haired kid? Anyway, Izuku recognized the voice as one of his classmates, but hadn't yet gotten the boy's name. He never speaks to anybody, just answers the teacher's questions like a robot. It's freaky. Yeah, and he knows every single one. Like, I know this is a smart school and everything, but it's really like the kid has an encyclopedia in his head. Maybe it's his quirk or something. Another boy from his class, Takeo was his name, Izuku thought. No, I overheard him talking to another kid at lunch today. Get this, apparently he's quirkless. A third boy, this one Izuku knew was named Taro. He had a quirk that allowed him to control what he smelled like, to a limited extent. No way. The first boy spoke up. How the hell did a quirkless loser make it into one of the greatest hero schools in the country? I heard he scored the top score on the entrance exam. Takeo said. What? No way. You're making that up. The first boy again. No, Shiro told me. He said he heard one of the teachers talking about it. Said the Midoriya kid aced every section and beat the second highest score by 5 whole points. The first boy definitely didn't like that news. He must have fucking cheated. I mean, have you seen the kid? He's a loser. He just sits alone and mumbles to himself all the time. No way a spaz like that could ace the exam. Not without some kind of intelligence quirk or without cheating. Izuku heard enough. He couldn't listen anymore. Without caring about his surroundings, he turned and bolted. He had no idea where he was going, taking turns and stares blindly. How could he have been so naive? Who cares if 2 people had been kind of nice to him? It didn't change the truth. He was a weird, quirkless loser. He was useless. He didn't belong here. He was a Deku, just like 𝐀𝐭 had always said. Eventually, he came across an empty classroom, set up lecture hall style. His feet carried him up to the front before he dropped his bag and clutched at the sides of his head, his hat falling to the ground forgotten. He tried to take some deep breaths to calm down, but it wasn't really helping, so he did the one thing that he knew he could do whenever he was upset. He started to sing. Dancing bears, painted wings, things I almost remember, and a song someone sings, Once Upon a December. Singing was his safe haven. It was a passion he'd discovered when he'd grown old enough to appreciate his mother's lullabies for what they were. Someone holds me safe and warm. Horses prance through a silver storm. Figures dancing gracefully across my memory. Once she recognized how much he enjoyed it. His mother had bought him several books on vocal technique, and it became a thing that he just did sometimes. Whenever he was bored, or anxious, or overwhelmed, he would start to sing. Whatever came to mind. He'd learned all kinds of songs from every genre and from all over the world. Far away, long ago. Glowing dim as an ember, things my heart used to know. Once upon a December. This song in particular was one he was especially fond of. The somber melody of it could really encapsulate his feelings of loneliness and isolation, especially now, so far away from the life he'd known. Even if it had been complicated, it had been familiar. Now nothing was. Someone holds me safe and warm. Horses prance through a silver storm, figures dancing gracefully across my memory. As he moved into the song's final verse, he dropped all consideration for where he was and what he was doing. He simply poured every emotion he was feeling into every note, let his fear and anxiety and isolation come flooding out of him through song. Far away, long ago, glowing dim as an ember, things my heart used to know, things it yearns to remember, and a song someone sings. He only realized that he'd shut his eyes at some point when he felt the single tear force itself from between his closed eyelids to slide down his cheek, just as he sang the final line. Once upon a December. He let out a long, low, shaky breath as the song ended. Holy shit. Izuku's eyes snapped open towards the sound to see 𝐀𝐦 standing there near the door to the classroom. Oh God, how long had she been standing there? 𝐀𝐦 Izuku started, already planning his escape from the room, from the school, from the country even. Izuku, that was amazing. Like, why didn't you tell me you could sing like that? Izuku was flabbergasted. She liked it. Oh, it's just something I do sometimes when I'm feeling overwhelmed. I've never really sang for anyone before, except my mom. Well, frankly, my guy, that is a crime. You should definitely let more people hear this. You gotta let me upload this online. People will lose their shit, fam. 𝐀𝐦 waved her phone in his general direction, and it was only then that he realized that she'd been holding it the whole time. Wait, you recorded me? Izuku shrieked. I couldn't help myself. Seriously, Izuku, your voice is fucking choice. I swear, if you upload this to YouTube, it'll go viral like crazy. No, Izuku shouted. I mean, no, please. I don't really feel comfortable putting myself out there like that. Besides, I'm glad you enjoyed it, but that doesn't mean anybody else will. Well, I think you're crazy, but fine. I'm keeping the video though. This shit is way too good to delete. Izuku hesitated for just a moment before acquiescing. Yeah, okay, that's fine. She smiled and pocketed her phone. Hey, are you alright though? You said you sing like that when you're overwhelmed, but you seemed cool when we left lunch just a minute ago. Something happened. Izuku's default smile faltered a bit as he remembered what had caused his breakdown. Oh yeah, no, I'm fine. Just overheard some of my classmates and it got me a little upset. Sorry, don't apologize. That's stupid. You can get upset if you need. That's like totally cool. 𝐀𝐦 said with uncharacteristic empathy. She rested a hand on his shoulder in comfort and paused for a moment before speaking again. What did they say anyway? Oh, it was really nothing. Izuku waved his arms in front of himself. I was just overreacting. They were just talking about how it's kinda weird that I'm so quiet and mumble to myself all the time. 𝐀𝐦 looked at him in a way that somehow showed support but also simultaneously told him she didn't buy his shit for a second. She knew there was more to it. It was honestly a little scary how she pulled it off. Okay, so maybe they also made some comments about me being quirkless and one of them accused me of cheating on the entrance exam since I got the highest score among all the applicants. Izuku quickly mumbled, but 𝐀𝐦 seemed to catch all of it somehow. Oh, is that right? 𝐀𝐦 asked with far too much casualness. Please, 𝐀𝐦, you don't have to do anything, it's fine. I'll just know to avoid those guys and then it won't be an issue. Calm down, Izuku, it's fine. I'm not gonna embarrass you. Now let's go. I'll walk with you to class since I'm on an off period. She turned and started for the door and Izuku simply followed, gathering up his bag and hat along the way. They walked in companionable silence before reaching his classroom door. He assumed they'd part ways here and she'd go on to wherever she was headed. but instead she pushed inside the door, dragging 𝐬𝐻𝐬 behind her. "Hey, listen up, fresh meat," 𝐀𝐦 announced at the class. Her voice still had its normal, bubbly quality to it, but she somehow also spoke with an earned authority that commanded attention, something he hadn't realized she was capable of. Whispers began to ring through the class among those who recognized the upperclassmen who'd just barged into their classroom. Apparently, 𝐀𝐦 was quite popular and well known from the sounds of things. "This here," she patted 𝐬𝐻𝐬 on the shoulder, "is my main man 𝐬𝐻𝐬. He's like my little bro, so if I hear about any of you little dweebs fucking with him, you're gonna have to answer to me, and I'm pretty sure most of you know what I can do, or have done, to you." The last line was said with an immensely threatening aura. But seriously, he's actually like a totally cool dude. Her bubbly personality was back in full force. "He's a little shy, but you should totally give him a shot. He's super nice and like crazy smart. You should totally ask him to sing for you, too." She gave him a little wink, ignoring the internal crisis that was going on in his head. "All right, sorry to interrupt, teach." 𝐀𝐦 gave the barest of acknowledgments to their teacher, who was just dumbfounded as to the display that had just occurred in his classroom. Fortunately, class had yet to actually start. "See you later, 𝐬𝐻𝐬." And with that she was gone, skipping off to wherever it was she was headed to next. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 felt like a hurricane had just ripped through his life. Hurricane 𝐀𝐦, showing up out of nowhere, turning everything in his life upside down, and then disappearing in an instant. He slowly turned his attention back to his classmates, who were all eyes on him. "Hey man, I'm 𝐬𝐻𝐬 and this is 𝐷𝐵𝐻𝐬." Two boys walked up and started shaking his hand. "You're mid or you're right. Sorry we haven't talked to you before. You want to join us for study group sometime?" "Oh sure, it's nice to meet you. I'd love to do a study group." Next was the girl whose desk was behind his own. "Hi, I'm 𝐴𝐻. I sit right behind you." "Oh cool, it's nice to meet you." And so it went, most of the class taking the time to get to know him and introduce themselves. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 knew that several of them were just doing it either out of fear of 𝐀𝐦's threat or out of some misplaced desire to use 𝐬𝐻𝐬 to get closer to the walking popularity bomb that was 𝐀𝐦 𝐡𝐚𝐭. But he figured at least a few had to be good people who actually wanted to be his friend. He just had to figure out which was which. And for now, he was perfectly happy to have at least one new friend in 𝐀𝐦, and possibly a second in 𝗬𝗧𝐻𝐸 if he played his cards right. The next few weeks went really well for 𝐬𝐻𝐬. He started to open up a bit more to his classmates and was pretty quickly able to determine who was actually trying to be friends with him and who was just nice out of a misguided sense of fear or ambition. He also did manage to see 𝗬𝗧𝐻𝐸 a few more times, mostly during lunch breaks. 𝐬𝐻𝐬, 𝐀𝐦, and 𝗀𝐻 became a regular lunch trio, and they were quickly becoming really good friends. They were even joined on occasion by 𝗀𝐻's mentor Nagamasa, who despite initial appearances was actually a very kind person. Not too surprising from someone selected to be their class president. The first day they'd eaten lunch together, 𝐀𝐦 had shown 𝗀𝐻 the recording of 𝐬𝐻𝐬's singing, much to his own ire. 𝗀𝐻 had been just as kind and supportive as he had been about 𝐬𝐻𝐬's quirklessness, though, which left 𝐬𝐻𝐬 feeling pretty warm and fluttery inside. 𝗀𝐻 had tried to then join 𝐀𝐦's insistence that 𝐬𝐻𝐬 should upload the video to share with people, but 𝐬𝐻𝐬 continued to hem and haw, feeling too embarrassed to really consider the proposition. Over the next few weeks, he'd honestly started to forget about the video entirely. That is, until he was walking to class and suddenly heard his own singing voice coming out of the phone of a student he'd never met before. "Whoa, he's so good," the boy was exclaiming to his friends, who were watching his phone from over his shoulder. "Who do you think it is? He's in the school uniform, so he must go here." "Yeah," one of his friends replied, "and I'm pretty sure that's the lecture hall on the 3rd floor that he's in." Why'd they blur his face out though? 𝐬𝐻𝐬 quickly shook himself from his staring before they caught him being creepy. He hurried along, trying to process what just happened. They were clearly watching a video on the student's phone. The audio was the song he'd been singing a few weeks ago. They mentioned a 𝐬𝐻𝐬 uniform and a lecture hall here in the school. It had to be 𝐀𝐦's video of him. But how were they watching it? He took only the tiniest modicum of comfort in the fact that they didn't seem to know who the singer was. One of them had mentioned face blurring. It didn't matter. Right now he was confused and a little pissed and only had one goal. He whipped out his phone to send a text to their group chat. 𝐬𝐻𝐬, 𝐀𝐦, where are you? 𝐀𝐦, oh god, please don't be too pissed. 𝐬𝐻𝐬, 𝐀𝐦, where are you? 𝗀𝐻, whoa, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 just walked past me in the hall. I've never seen him so mad. Everything okay? 𝐬𝐻𝐬, why the heck did I just see some kids in the hall watching what looked like your video of my song from a few weeks ago? Your very private video that I pretty clearly said I didn't want anyone to see. 𝗀𝐻, oh shit. 𝐀𝐦, okay, yes, I put up the video even though you didn't really want to, but in my defense you were being dumb. The only reason you didn't want the video posted is because you were afraid people wouldn't like it, but that's just dumb. Your singing is baller, 𝐬𝐻𝐬, and guess what? Everyone else agrees. This shit is amazing. And everybody in the comments is losing their minds for you. 𝐬𝐡𝐤, they are. 𝐸𝐡𝐤, yeah, 𝐬𝐡𝐤. I just pulled up the video. People in the comments love you, buddy. And the face blur is really well done. You really can't tell that it's you. 𝐬𝐡𝐤, oh, well then. Thanks, I think. 𝐀𝐦, of course, 𝐍𝐶𝐭. I figured I'd have to physically beat you over the head with people's praise to get you to realize you're actually freaking amazing. You should really consider doing more of this. Make like a full channel. We could get you a mask or whatever so you can hide who you are, even if I think that's pretty dumb. 𝐬𝐡𝐤, I'll think about it. 𝐸𝐡𝐤, that's the spirit. 𝐬𝐡𝐤. 𝐀𝐦, also, can we talk about the fact that even when you were pissed as hell you still censored yourself to say heck instead of just cursing? We need to work on that filter of yours, 𝐬𝐡𝐤. You're too pure. 𝐸𝐡𝐤, 𝐀𝐦, no. Don't corrupt him. I like him as he is. 𝐀𝐦, oh do you now? 𝐬𝐡𝐤, 𝐬𝐡𝐢𝐬, I gotta go to class. See y'all at lunch. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 is offline. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 shoved his phone as deep into his pocket as he could, hurrying off towards his classroom, for once thankful he didn't share a homeroom class with either of his best friends. As he stepped into the classroom and sat at his desk, he really wasn't sure if the blush on his face was more because of the video of him singing that was plastered all over the internet or because 𝐸𝐡𝐤 had said he liked him. Surely it was the former, right? The next several months at 𝐬𝐡𝐤 went really well for 𝐬𝐡𝐤. He grew closer with his new best friends, 𝐀𝐦 and 𝐸𝐡𝐤. He made decent relationships with the other kids in his class, some of them even becoming something like friends. He continued to make good grades and was sitting at the top of his class. It wasn't all perfect, of course. The boy he'd overheard accusing him of cheating on the entrance exam, Haru, still didn't like 𝐬𝐡𝐤, and he was constantly bitter about 𝐬𝐡𝐤 showing him up in the rankings. Haru was never too mean, though, most likely due to 𝐀𝐦's not-so-veiled threat, and even at his meanest, he had nothing on 𝐀𝐦. Speaking of 𝐀𝐦, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 and his mother had continued their annual tradition of settling into the living room with drinks and snacks and watching the UA Sports Festival when it came around. This time was different though, because this time 𝐬𝐡𝐤 had a specific person to cheer for. He couldn't help himself. Even after everything he and the explosive blonde had been through, he still looked up to him. He still thought 𝐀𝐦 was amazing, because he was. 𝐀𝐦 made a sweeping declaration to kick off the festival, stating he would be the winner. It clearly pissed off all of his competitors, but it left 𝐬𝐡𝐤 buzzing with anticipation. That declaration wasn't made by a cocky and overconfident 𝐀𝐦. It was made by a 𝐀𝐦 who spoke with nothing but the utmost conviction. He turned out to be right too. 𝐀𝐦 took the whole thing. It wasn't a walk in the park, though. He'd had several close battles. Uraraka, the girl with the anti-gravity quirk, and Kirishima, the boy with the hardening quirk, both put up solid fights against 𝐀𝐦, but his powerful quirk and lightning-fast reflexes were too much to overcome. The greatest battle had been against the son of the number 2 hero, 𝗵𝗲. Todoroki had swept through every opponent with ease up until 𝐀𝐦. No one had given him a challenge at all. 𝐬𝐡𝐤 thought the purple-haired boy who had some kind of mind-controlling quirk might have been able to pull it off, but he clearly had some kind of activation condition that he couldn't get Todoroki to meet. Maybe it was vocal in some way. Todoroki never seemed to say anything to his opponents, so that would make sense. But 𝐬𝐡𝐤 hadn't worried. He knew 𝐀𝐦 would come out on top, just as he said he would. The fight was an epic brawl of massive glaciers, booming explosions, ice slides, and shouted words. When it came to an end, Todoroki was out cold and 𝐀𝐦 was the winner. The blonde didn't seem happy, though. He seemed angry and had to be held back and knocked out by Miss Midnight's quirk while he was screaming at Todoroki's unconscious body. From what little the mics were able to pick up, 𝐬𝐡𝐤 was able to confirm something he'd been suspecting the entire festival. Todoroki had a second quirk related to fire that he was refusing to use for some reason. His mother had made a comment about how 𝐀𝐦 had apparently only gotten worse when they saw that he'd had to be physically restrained in order to receive his medal, but 𝐬𝐡𝐤 felt bad for him, because he understood. To 𝐀𝐦, winning meant nothing if his opponent wasn't really trying, because Todoroki had refused to use the other half of his quirk. The victory was hollow and 𝐀𝐦 didn't want to accept it. He actually felt a little bit of empathetic rage build up in him at seeing his childhood best friend treated that way. Sure, the boy was angry and aggressive and hard to deal with, but to physically chain him up and lock his hands up in quirk-suppressing cuffs, it was outrageous. Ultimately, though, he'd swallowed his anger and focused on celebrating 𝐀𝐦's victory. He truly was amazing. He also focused on organizing the insane amount of notes he'd compiled on all of the quirks he'd seen during the festival. It was a habit he hadn't been able to break himself of. He loved to analyze quirks, their possible applications, their weaknesses, their strengths. He simply couldn't turn that part of his brain off. It was always going. The crazy thing was that he was now around people who actually seemed to value that part of his personality. After providing a few tips and suggestions to both 𝐀𝐦 and 𝐸𝐡𝐤, they'd apparently bragged about it so much that several of the hero course students were regularly coming to him for advice. Even Shishikura had begrudgingly asked him for his analysis of his quirk. though he'd made sure to frame it as simply making sure my classmates are getting adequate advice and analysis. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 couldn't help but chuckle, not only at the older boy's insistence on keeping up appearances, but also at the fact that his quirk was called meatball. So on the nose, and kinda gross. It was hard to believe, compared to how things had gone in middle school and how terrified he'd been at the start of the year. But all in all, things were going pretty well. Oh, he almost forgot to mention, he'd also, at the extensive urging of 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐭, made his own official YouTube channel where he'd begun to record and share his singing. He'd really been against the idea, but people really seemed to enjoy the video 𝐀𝐦 uploaded of him singing Once Upon a December. In the end, what finally convinced him wasn't any of 𝐀𝐦's arguments of becoming YouTube famous, or 𝐀𝐦's insistence on how talented he was. What convinced him was a single YouTube comment. As was the nature of the internet, it was left anonymously, but the words stuck with 𝐬𝐻𝐻. "I just want to thank you for putting this out there. I was having a really rough time when I came across this video, and your singing really helped bring me out of it. The raw emotion you pour into your singing speaks volumes, and I just wanted you to know that it helped me. So, thank you, whoever you are." 𝐬𝐻𝐻 had been in tears when he read that comment, and it had been the final push he'd needed to create the channel. If his singing could help even one person, then it was worth any embarrassment he might feel about putting it out there. It was worth any negative comments he would get. It was worth just about anything. All he'd ever wanted to do was help people. It was the core thing that drove his old dream of being a hero. So if singing could do that, even a little, then he would do it. He'd only set a handful of rules with 𝐀𝐦 when he sat down to make the channel with her. First, he would be fully in charge of the page and moderating and responding to any comments. He wanted to communicate with any followers directly, and not through someone else. Second, he would always wear a mask and hoodie to cover as much of his features as possible. He didn't want anyone knowing who he was, so he wanted to take as many steps as he could to ensure anonymity. Finally, and this was the one that he'd had to put his foot down on when 𝐀𝐦 objected, he didn't want to monetize the channel or any of the videos. As far as 𝐬𝐻𝐻 was concerned, his singing wasn't anything special and wasn't anything he had a desire to make money off of. It was something he did for fun and for his own emotional release when needed. And now it was something he did to potentially help people. He didn't want to make them sit through ads just to hear him sing. The whole idea of it seemed preposterous. And so, after hammering out the details, his YouTube channel was born. He debated with himself for a long time on what to call it. But ultimately he settled on the only name that made any sense to him, Deku. He knew it was strange to use that old nickname that had pretty much only ever been used to torment and taunt him, but there was a familiarity to it that he couldn't escape. Maybe it was just his last desperate attempt to cling to the life he'd left behind. Regardless, nothing else he could come up with felt right, so he decided to stick with Deku. Maybe he could turn it into something more positive, something he could remember years from now with a smile. And to his great surprise, the channel was doing really well. He was by no means internet famous, but he had a good number of subscribers and people who regularly commented nice things on his videos. There were, of course, some trolls and people who just wanted to be mean, but 𝐬𝐻𝐻 mostly ignored those people. Sometimes it was hard though, because he'd wanted to be sure to interact with and reply to anyone who tried to engage with him. He'd had to quickly give up on that idea, though, partially because there was nothing you could say to people who just wanted to be mean and vile for no good reason, but also because of the sheer number of comments he got sometimes. If he wanted to spend the necessary amount of time studying, doing his homework, and spending time with his new friends, then he simply didn't have time to reply to everyone. That said, he'd never been able to stop himself from reading every comment on his videos, even the mean ones. It didn't bother him most days, but occasionally a comment would say just the right thing to send him into a depressive spiral. But 𝐀𝐦 and 𝐀𝐦 were always there for him, so it always turned out okay. Speaking of 𝐀𝐦, 𝐬𝐻𝐻 had made a discovery about himself in the last few months. He was attracted to other guys. Not that this was a total surprise to him. Really, he'd already suspected as much for a while given his admiration for 𝐀𝐦 for so many years, even despite the bullying. What was a surprise to him was that he most definitely had a crush on 𝐀𝐦. How could he not? 𝐀𝐦 was so nice, and enthusiastic, and cheerful. He was the first person in 𝐬𝐻𝐻's life to be unfalteringly supportive and kind to him, even after finding out he was quirkless. Even 𝐬𝐻𝐻's own mother, despite her love for her son, had faltered when the quirkless diagnosis had come through, but 𝐀𝐦 had taken it in stride and dismissed it entirely. To him, it didn't matter at all. 𝐀𝐦 was an amazing guy and would become an amazing hero. 𝐬𝐻𝐻 just knew it. And damn if he wasn't attractive too. He was so strong and masculine. He could easily pick 𝐬𝐻𝐻 up with no effort whatsoever, and had done so, in fact, several times with overly enthusiastic hugs that left 𝐬𝐻𝐻 a flustered, blushing mess. So yeah, that was awkward. He was doing his best to suppress those feelings, of course. There was no way 𝐀𝐦 liked 𝐬𝐻𝐻 the same way. He was a super nice guy, and was always doing kind and supportive things for 𝐬𝐻𝐻, but that didn't mean he liked him. Not like that anyway. I mean, how could he? 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 had thought to himself more than once. He's such a strong, attractive, amazing guy, and I'm just plain old 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬. But that aside, things were going really well in 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬's life for once. That is, right up until they weren't. Nothing had gone wrong in 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬's life directly, per se. But it sure as hell felt like his entire world had twisted itself upside down when news broke that villains had attacked a UA summer training camp. Not only had they attacked the camp, but they'd kidnapped a student as well. Not just any student, either, but one Katsuki Bakugo. Villains had kidnapped 𝐀𝐦. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 knew exactly why they'd taken him, but he simultaneously couldn't believe the villains would be so stupid. Didn't they understand 𝐀𝐦 at all? Was 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 the only one who did? Yes, the blonde was angry and aggressive and downright violent sometimes. But there was no way 𝐀𝐦 would ever become a villain. It simply didn't fit with the laws of the universe. In 𝐀𝐦's mind, he was a hero. Not just a hero, but the best hero in the world. Nothing and no one would ever shake that unwavering belief that 𝐀𝐦 had that he would grow up to be a hero even greater than All Might. Villains could hold him for years and that still wouldn't change. That still didn't stop 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 from worrying. Who knew what kind of awful things the villains were doing to his childhood best friend? 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 was an anxious, nervous wreck. He didn't respond to any of his friends and spent as much time as possible in his room, keeping as little interaction with anyone, even his mother, as possible. For the several days 𝐀𝐦 was taken, he couldn't bring himself to do anything. He barely ate, barely slept, he just sat and paced and worried. He couldn't even bring himself to sing to get his emotions out. He tried, but nothing came. Then, one late night, news alerts rang out that there was some kind of crazy battle going on in 𝐀𝐦 Ward. The heroes had made their move to rescue 𝐀𝐦. By the time news choppers had gotten on the scene, a huge chunk of the ward was already destroyed, reduced to nothing but rubble. All Might was there and he was facing off against some awful villain who seemed to be the one unleashing all the destruction and was meeting All Might blow for blow. There was no sign of 𝐀𝐦 anywhere, but 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 kept trying to reassure himself that that was likely a good thing. The heroes had probably gotten him away safely while All Might took on the lead villain. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 watched, along with the rest of the country and the rest of the world, as All Might fought his final battle. He came out the victor, the villain toppled and defeated, but it was determined later that All Might had used the last of his strength. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 had never forgotten his encounter with All Might on the rooftop that day. The shocking revelation that All Might was living with a horrible injury that limited his power. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 had kept that secret to himself since that day, and had always planned to do so, but now it seemed like the secret was out there. And it seemed it had led to the inescapable retirement of the #1 hero. The one piece of good news, aside from the capture of almost the entire league of villains, was that 𝐀𝐦 had successfully been rescued and that he was reported to be virtually unharmed. That, more than anything else, allowed 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 to breathe a sigh of relief and finally get some much-needed rest. The following day, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 did a lot of thinking and processing. The #1 hero All Might had retired and now his de facto replacement was Endeavor. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 had never been Endeavor's biggest fan, though he couldn't exactly tell you why. There was just something about the man that rubbed 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 the wrong way. Something that didn't feel very heroic. It was looking like the beginning of a dark time in Japan. People all over the country were beginning to express doubts about the future of hero society in the country. After watching so many of its greatest institutions fail so terribly, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 could certainly empathize with those concerns. But something inside still gave him hope. He couldn't really explain it, but despite the darkness hanging over this moment in time, there was still a ray of light shining in the distance. Something coming that would reaffirm the world's faith in heroes. Maybe it had something to do with All Might's final words to the camera after the battle. Now, it's your turn," All Might had said, his finger pointed straight into the camera. Most people online seemed to think that the statement was meant as a warning to other villains, but there was something about it that made 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 think differently. To 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐬, it seemed more like the passing of a mantle. Like All Might was telling someone that it was their turn to pick up where he left off. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐬 had no idea who he could be talking to, but it still inspired him regardless. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐬 hadn't been able to stop the tears that had flowed when he saw All Might say those words. Now, though, the world needed hope. They needed to be told that even though things were dark right now, that if they just held on, then light would come and things would get better. The only way 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐬 knew how to do that was through singing. So he put on his hoodie and mask, making sure that all of his hair was covered and that the mask was firmly in place. He turned on his setup, started recording, hit play on the backing track, and began to sing. The sky is dyed with crimson red that comes out of the darkness of what needs to be said. The stars we used to know no longer glow, obscured by all the ash that falls like snow. He knew that this song was a bit emo and he'd definitely get some people online poking fun at him because of it, but he didn't care. All he'd ever done was choose music that spoke to him, that helped him feel and express the emotions that were inside. And this song did that for him now. All of my hopes are in a shroud of desolation. Dreams that I once had have all been crushed now that everything's changed. I have been holding on so desperately to the precious things that I cannot protect." As he continued to sing the song, he thought of everything that had happened to him up to now. He thought of the people he loved and cared about. His mom, 𝐀𝐻𝐦 𝐍𝐭. He thought of the negative things that had happened in his life. His quirkless diagnosis, 𝐀𝐻𝐦's turn from best friend to bully, the sludge villain attack, his meeting with All Might on the roof. He thought of how, despite the negativity of those things, they had still helped shape his life and led him to the good things he had now. His acceptance at 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬, his new friendships with 𝐀𝐻𝐦 and 𝗀𝐻𝐻, and the kids in his class, his YouTube channel. Even if all the light around us is extinguished, even if the earth is turned to dust, I won't ever forget that tiny wish that burns eternally. It will guide us to a better world. Somewhere this was the message he wanted to get across, that even in the darkest of times, even when bad things happen, you can use them to motivate yourself, to reach inside and grab onto whatever it is that gives you happiness and hope. Every time that I'm cut by broken shards of what was once a dream, I will reach into the darkness of my heart, and I will try to find the strength to carry on, 'cause I've made it this far. As the song ended, he took a deep breath and then looked into the camera. He usually didn't say anything before or after videos, but he felt like something needed to be said here. I know things are really crazy right now. A lot of things are in question about the future, but we just have to hold on to whatever can give us hope. Whether that's your favorite hero, your friends, your family, your favorite hobbies, it doesn't matter. Just remember that eventually we'll get through the darkness and light will shine again. All we have to do is hang on until that day comes. I love you all. Thank you. His message finished. He shut off the recording and got to work editing everything together and preparing it for upload. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 still wasn't used to having friends. It was an odd experience. Today was a good example of that. It was a Saturday, partway into the new fall term, and it had started like any other Saturday for 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬. He got up in the morning, took a shower, had breakfast with his mother, and then settled into his room to do some studying as well as some hero analysis if any interesting thoughts or events came up. Then he got a text message. 𝐀𝐻𝐦, yo, I'm bored, fam. Let's all go hang out at the mall. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 was surprised. He'd never really been invited to just hang out before, at least not since he was 4 and 𝐀𝐻𝐦 would ask him to go beetle hunting with him in the summers. 𝗀𝐻𝐻, that's a great idea, 𝐀𝐻𝐦. We don't get to see each other off campus enough. Oh God. And now 𝗀𝐻𝐻, otherwise known as the target of his schoolboy crush, was going to be there. Maybe this wasn't such a good idea. 𝐀𝐻𝐦, sweet. Meet there in like 30. And you better be there, too, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬. Wouldn't be the same without you. 𝗀𝐻𝐻, that's right. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬, you've got to come with us. It'll be so much fun. Even in text message format, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 could hear 𝗀𝐻𝐻's energetic and bombastic tone. It was like those exclamation points had special meaning when he typed them out. Well, he supposed he had no choice now. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬, yeah, that sounds fun. Thanks for inviting me. 𝐀𝐻𝐦, ooh, so formal. You gotta learn to talk more cash, fam. 𝗀𝐻𝐻, that's great, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬. I'm looking forward to seeing you. And 𝐀𝐻𝐦, he can text however he wants to. Was that a plural you or singular? Was 𝗀𝐻𝐻 saying he was looking forward to seeing 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 specifically, or just the group of them together? Calm down, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬, he thought to himself. You're just overanalyzing things as always. Go change and meet your friends. Be a normal teenager for once in your life. He dug through his closet for a few minutes before eventually settling on some casual cargo pants and one of his t-shirt shirts, before double-checking with his mom that it was okay to go out. Hey mom, some of my friends from school invited me to the mall with them. Is it okay if I go? He poked his head into the kitchen as he finished asking, only to see tears already begin to well up in his mother's eyes. Mom, what's wrong? Oh, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬. She lunged forward and grabbed him into an almost too tight hug. I'm so happy for you. You're finally getting friends and going out. I was so worried when we moved that you'd have a tough time making new friends. But you have, and I'm just so proud of you. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 struggled a bit to breathe as he wrapped his arms around his crying mother. He barely remembered his father, but even still there was little doubt where his tendency to cry at the littlest things came from. So does this mean it's okay for me to go? He asked. Oh, of course, sweetie. She released her tight grip and reached for her purse. Here, take some extra money with you so you can get lunch and buy yourself something. Just make sure you're home in time for dinner and call me if you need anything. Thanks, Mom, I will. He'd learned a long time ago not to try to refuse money when his mom offered. He would always feel guilty about it, since he knew how hard it must be for her to support them both on her own, but she tended to get upset if he tried to refuse. Grabbing the money, he gave his mom a kiss goodbye on the cheek, then threw on his classic red shoes and headed out the door to go meet his friends at the mall. 20 minutes later, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐬 was stepping off the train and headed towards the nearby shopping mall. It wasn't quite as big as the 𝐀𝐻𝐦 Ward shopping mall, but it wasn't far off. The proximity to 𝐓�2 meant that they had frequent customers in the form of aspiring hero students, faculty, and staff from the school and anyone else drawn to the area because of the school's presence. It was an indoor, multi-story affair with all kinds of shops, a movie theater, and a massive food court. In all honesty, it would be super easy to lose track of someone in this place. Just as he was thinking this, Izuku realized they hadn't set an actual meeting point once they got here. He was about to pull out his phone to start messaging when he heard an unmistakable voice shout out over the crowd towards him. "Izuku, 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐶𝐭 voice carried, probably because the man himself towered over everyone around him. He was easy to pick out when Izuku turned towards the voice. He really was just unfairly handsome. Even wearing a mildly beat-up graphic tee, some loose-fitting pants, and a pair of comfy sandals, Izuku was still distracted by 𝐁𝐻's good looks and masculine frame. No one would call his dress code fashionable by any means. But then again, Izuku really wasn't any better. "Hey 𝐁𝐻," Izuku said once he'd finally made his way through the crowd over to the taller boy. "Have you been here long?" "Not at all. I just got here a few minutes ago." "Have you heard from 𝐀𝐦 yet?" "No, I haven't." "Should we text?" He was interrupted mid-question by both of their phones buzzing. "𝐀𝐦, hey boys, sorry, but something came up, so I'm not gonna be able to make it. You two make sure to have fun though." Oh god, 𝐀𝐦 had bailed on them. That meant, oh, well, I guess it's just you and me then, 𝐁𝐻 said with enthusiasm. That meant he was spending the day at the mall, alone with his crush. This wasn't gonna be easy. The first several minutes were spent in soul-crushingly awkward silence as they wandered aimlessly through the mall, looking at all the different shops as they passed. It was an odd situation for Izuku, and probably 𝐁𝐻 too, though for different reasons. For Izuku, he was torn between the desire to spend all day with 𝐁𝐻, getting to know him better, and the desire to run away screaming before he inevitably did or said something stupid and embarrassed himself forever. Plus, spending all day with Izuku probably wasn't in 𝐁𝐻's top 10 favorite things to do with his weekend, so he felt bad for this situation being forced on him. Then the inevitable happened. They walked past a hero merch store. Oh my god. They have the new limited edition Bronze Age All Might TM figure. It's modeled after his fight against 𝐻𝐸, a villain he fought when he was in America. Specifically, the fight was in Texas, and it was the first time he ever used his Texas Smash. Izuku pressed himself up against the glass to get a closer look at the display figure in the window. They got the detailing on the rips in his costume just right, too, because the fight took place right next to a local TV station. There's actually a ton of footage of it, more than most of his fights. The villain was really full of himself, hence his name, and thought he could take on All Might, but despite his strong quirk, All Might took him down. You see, the key was, Izuku cut himself off mid-ramble as he looked over and saw 𝐁𝐻's jaw hanging open in surprise. "Oh, sorry. I tend to get excited and carried away about hero stuff sometimes. I mean, I know you've seen me get distracted in my mumbling before, but you've never seen me go off into full fanboy mode like that because I do my best to keep it under control at school. But here I kind of let my guard down, and I'm sure it's kind of weird and creepy to see me do this, so I'm really sorry, Izuku." 𝐁𝐻 cut him off himself this time. "It's really okay. I was just surprised, that's all. You know so much about this stuff, and it's clear how happy it makes you. You should see the look on your face when you do that. It's..." He seemed to pause there for a while, as if having an internal debate about which word to use. "Amazing," he finally settled on. Izuku blushed deeply, hoping the other boy wouldn't notice. "Oh, thanks, 𝐁𝐻. Most people tend to get annoyed when I ramble like that, so I try pretty hard to keep it in check." "Well, that's too bad. It's just part of what makes you, you. You shouldn't try so hard to suppress it just for others." Izuku was left stunned for a moment. He still couldn't believe that he had a friend who was so caring and understanding. After a moment, he finally managed to stutter out another quiet thanks. "Of course. So, do you want to go in and get it?" "Oh no, it's way too expensive. I'm just happy to have gotten to admire it a little bit." 𝐁𝐻 seemed to ponder this for just a moment before speaking. Well, okay then. If you're sure. How about lunch? I don't know about you, but I'm starving." Izuku smiled as the taller boy's usual enthusiasm took over once more. "Yeah, that sounds great. Let's go." They headed over to the food court and each found their preferred meals before taking a seat at a small empty table off to the side. Izuku got himself a bowl of katsudon that was good, but nowhere near as good as his mom's, and 𝐁𝐻 had a piping hot bowl of udon noodles. "Wow, Izuku, your food looks so good." "Thanks, 𝐁𝐻. Katsudon's my favorite. And your noodles look delicious." "Yeah, they're my favorite." 𝐁𝐻 took a long slurp of noodles, and Izuku tried hard not to stare too long at the bobbing of 𝐁𝐻's Adam's apple as he swallowed. "So, tell me more about this All Might fight. You've got me interested." "Oh, really?" Izuku lit up at the opportunity to gush about his favorite hero. "Sure, I'd love to." They spent their lunch going back and forth, Izuku providing every detail about the fight that he could remember, which was pretty much all of them. 𝐁𝐻 would interject with enthusiastic comments and questions, and before they knew it an entire hour had passed. Wow, Zuko, your enthusiasm for All Might is infectious. He's your favorite hero, right? Oh, definitely. I grew up wanting to be just like him. Despite his best efforts, Izuku let a little bit of sadness slip into his thoughts. I don't focus much on being a hero anymore, but I still want to help people. I haven't fully figured out how yet, but I know that whatever I do, I still want to do everything I can to help people. That's amazing, Izuku. Inasa's voice sounded softer than usual. If Izuku didn't know any better, he'd almost say it sounded fond. They sat in a comfortable silence for a few moments before Inasa spoke again, back to his usual bombastic tone. So, do you like any other heroes? Izuku brightened immediately, happy to talk about his favorite hobby. Oh yeah, tons. Most of the top heroes I follow pretty closely. I love to analyze their moves, fighting styles, and quirks. I watch all the fights I can get my hands on. That's awesome. Suddenly, Inasa's whole demeanor shifted slightly, and his voice became more serious, almost a little dark. What do you think about 𝗓𝗓? Izuku rubbed the back of his neck and looked to the side. He's not my favorite, if I'm being honest. Couldn't tell you exactly why, there's just something off about him. It's the eyes, Inasa said with absolute seriousness. I met him once, when I was a kid. He was rude and dismissive, but more than that there was a look in his eyes. They were filled with hatred, like the entire world could burn for all he cared. The look in Inasa's eyes was like one he'd never seen on the usually happy and energetic boy. It was a look filled with something approaching a hatred of his own, but this one directed squarely towards 𝗓𝗓𝗓. The taller boy wasn't even looking at Izuku anymore. His attention had been shifted into the middle distance, likely imagining what that day had been like. I met his son once, too, at the UA entrance exam for recommended students. He had the same look in his eyes, like there was something he hated more than anything, and that hatred was all that mattered to him. The two of them are just alike. It's why I decided not to go to UA, in fact, and came to Shiksu instead. Well, Izuku began cautiously, not wanting to upset his friend. I've never met either 𝗓𝗓𝗓 or his son, but just remember, if 𝗓𝗓𝗓 is that awful and hateful in just brief interactions with fans, just imagine what it must be like to live with him. It can't be easy being that man's son. Inasa seemed to ponder this for a long while. I hadn't thought of it that way. It's hard to forget the hatred in the kid's eyes that day, but you may be right. I'll try to keep that in mind. Thanks, Izuku. Of course. Izuku tried to put on his biggest smile to lighten the mood a little. Hey, do you want to go see a movie? My mom gave me some money for today, and there's that new All Might movie that just came out. Suddenly, Inasa was back to his normal self once again. Yeah, that sounds awesome. Let's go. They cleared up the trash from their meals and made their way over to the theater. There was some debate upon arrival about who would pay for the tickets, but Izuku insisted, saying that his mom would get upset if she thought he didn't spend enough of the money she gave him. Inasa relented, but insisted that he owed Izuku for it later, and with tickets purchased they headed inside to find some seats. The theater was decently crowded, since it was a weekend only a few weeks after the initial release, but they managed to get decent seats in one of the back rows and settled in to watch the film. Izuku quite enjoyed it, but then again he knew he would. He liked all of All Might's movies. All Might himself wasn't actually in it, of course, but the actor that portrayed him had a passable shapeshifting quirk that made him look the part quite well, and he did a great job at capturing All Might's general mannerisms and demeanor. Overall, Izuku was having a great time and was getting fully absorbed into the plot. And then the romance plot appeared. Izuku had always disliked when they tried to cram romance plotlines into All Might movies. They never felt natural. And there was hardly ever any chemistry between All Might and whoever the love interest for that particular film was. In this case, though, Izuku had a new problem. Seeing all of the cute little flirty and romantic moments on screen while sitting right next to his crush in a dark movie theater was making his stomach do a full Cirque du Soleil routine. He kept glancing over to look at Inasa out of the corner of his eye, and he could almost swear that Inasa was doing the same. And they both seemed to be fidgeting awkwardly every time a romantic scene was playing on screen. What the heck was going on? Was this affecting Inasa the same way as Izuku? No way, that made no sense. Mercifully, the movie came to end, All Might saving the day and getting the girl as always, and they made their way back out into the mall. Do you want to get some coffee before we have to head back home? Inasa asked. Sure, that sounds nice. They made their way over to a small coffee shop near one of the main entrances. This time, Inasa refused to let Izuku pay for his coffee, so he didn't put up a fight on it. They got their drinks, coffee with cream and 2 sugars for Inasa, and a super sweet caramel latte thing for Izuku, and took a seat by the window. I had a really great time today, Izuku, Inasa said after they'd both settled in and taken a few sips of their coffee. Me too. Izuku couldn't help the smile that crossed his face. Sorry about the movie, though. Inasa looked confused. What do you mean? I thought it was great. Oh, it just seemed like some of the romance stuff made you uncomfortable. Oh, you noticed that? Inasa paused for a moment like he was having some internal debate with himself. Izuku waited patiently before Inosa spoke again. Actually, the truth is that it felt awkward to be watching that kind of stuff. Because of you. Izuku was taken aback. Had Inosa figured out about his crush? Did it make him feel uncomfortable? Oh god, of course it did. Why wouldn't it? Yeah, you see, Zuko, the truth is. He took a deep breath and then looked Izuku straight in the eye and spoke with extreme intensity befitting his personality. I like you, Izuku. Izuku felt his mouth fall open and only barely managed to maintain his grip on his coffee. What? Why you? You all like me? Damn it, why the hell couldn't he keep his stutter under control right now? Of all the times. Well, yeah, you're an amazing guy, Zuko. You're kind and heartfelt and really smart. It's hard not to like you. Izuku could swear his face was redder than All Might's Silver Age costume. It took him more than a few moments to collect his thoughts enough to respond in a voice so quiet he would be surprised if Inosa heard him. I like you too. You do? Inosa asked with such surprise that Izuku snapped his head up to stare in disbelief at the taller boy. Of course I do. You're so strong and kind, and you were the first person to ever be nice to me and supportive of me even after finding out I was quirkless. Even my mom, as much as she loved me, didn't know how to support me after we found out. But you were amazing right off the bat. You have no idea how much it meant to me. Izuku wasn't surprised to feel a few tears welling up in his eyes, but he blinked them back before he could shed them. He didn't want Inosa to think he was sad, because that would be the exact opposite of the truth. Oh, Inosa said, well in that case, Izuku, will you go out with me? The held-back tears couldn't be restrained any longer, but he did his best not to let them get too out of control. Yes, of course I will. Awesome, I'm so glad. Inosa beamed. It was a beautiful sight. Listen, though, as I'm sure you remember from orientation, the school has a pretty strict policy about students getting into romantic relationships with each other. Oh yeah, it's pretty much forbidden, right? Izuku asked, letting a little bit of worry creep into his mind about what this would mean. Yeah, but from what I've heard, it's not out of the question for students to do it anyway, they just have to be careful. So, we won't really be able to tell many people and we won't be able to act like it at school. I hope that's okay. Oh yeah, I totally get it. We don't want to get in trouble or anything, so we can just hang out on weekends like this when our schedules allow it anyway. I know you're busy a lot with hero training. Right, of course, Inosa said, as if he'd only just remembered that himself. We'll still find time for each other though, promise. Izuku smiled. I'd like that. His phone chose that exact moment to start dinging at him. Oh shoot, that's my reminder alarm. I need to get the train back home soon if I want to make it back home for dinner. Oh, well let me walk you to the station, then. Thank you, Inosa. I'd like that. After they cleaned up their dishes from their coffee, they started heading out the door. Oh, let me use the restroom real quick before we go. Don't want to get stuck on the train. Izuku giggled as he made his way towards the restroom. Of course, I actually had one quick thing I wanted to grab, so I'll meet you at the exit we met at earlier. Inosa replied. Sounds good. See you in a sec. Izuku quickly took care of his business and then started heading towards the entrance he'd first ran into Inosa this morning. He arrived ahead of the taller boy and took a moment to think back on the day. Wow, Inosa is my boyfriend, Izuku thought. I can hardly believe it. If you'd told him this morning that the day would end with him dating his crush, he'd have nervously laughed his way into a breakdown, but here he was. It was actually happening. Hey, Izuku, there you are. Hard to find you sometimes in this crowd, Inosa called as he reached the smaller boy. Izuku turned to look at him and opened his mouth to speak, but he froze when he saw the bag in Inosa's hand. It had the logo of the hero merch store they'd seen earlier branded on the side. Inosa, tell me you didn't. Surprise. Inosa held the bag out to him with a smile. Izuku took the offered bag on autopilot and then stared down into it. Looking back up at him was the figure, the limited edition Bronze Age All Might TM figure he'd been admiring. The one he assumed he'd never be able to get. He couldn't hold back the tears at all this time. Inosa, thank you so much. You really shouldn't have done that. I wanted to though. I know how much you were admiring it, and it's the least I can do for my boyfriend. Izuku practically melted hearing the word come out of Inosa's mouth. He wiped the tears from his eyes and gave his biggest smile up to Inosa. Thank you. It's really sweet of you. It'll get pride of place in my collection. Inosa smiled back down at him warmly. You're very welcome, Zuko. With that, they turned and started heading towards the train station. Halfway there, Inosa apparently grew bold and slipped his hand down into Izuku's. The size difference between the two of them in their hands was almost comical, but still it felt mostly comfortable. It was still a little awkward to be holding hands with someone who'd only ever been his friend up to that point, but he still made sure to enjoy it. They wouldn't get to do it very often, given the school policy. Upon arriving at the train station, they turned to face each other. My train will be here in just a second, so I guess this is bye for now. Yeah, I guess it is. Inosa hesitated for just a moment before speaking again in a very fast and nervous tone. but still laced with that same classic 𝐬𝐻 energy. 𝐬𝐻, I'd like to kiss you. Would that be okay? 𝐬𝐻's eyes widened at the question and he felt his face get hot yet again. He couldn't make his mouth form words, so he simply nodded his head. 𝐬𝐻 slowly but surely leaned his head down, 𝐬𝐻 rising on his tiptoes to try and meet partway, and their lips met. It was an extremely awkward kiss, given that neither of them had any experience whatsoever, their noses pressing up against each other uncomfortably, but 𝐬𝐻 didn't care. It was his first kiss with his new boyfriend. After a moment they broke apart and 𝐬𝐻 noticed his train had arrived and was getting ready to leave. Oh shoot, I've gotta go. Thank you again for the present 𝐬𝐻. I love it and I'll see you at school on Monday. Of course, 𝐬𝐻. Have a safe trip home and I'll see you Monday. 𝐬𝐻 managed to shout back right as the train doors slipped closed and 𝐬𝐻 started his short journey home. He slumped down into an open seat on the train and clutched his new gift to his chest tightly. He was barely able to keep himself from squealing in glee, knowing that if he did it would make him look like a crazy person to the other train passengers. Partway home, a thought occurred to him that wouldn't leave his brain. He needed to confirm it, so he pulled out his phone and scrolled to his private chat thread with 𝐀𝐦. 𝐬𝐻, you did that on purpose, didn't you? 𝐀𝐦, I have no idea what you're talking about. 𝐬𝐻, P. Hope you boys enjoyed your date. 𝐬𝐻, 𝐬𝐻. Thanks 𝐀𝐦, you're welcome. The rest of the weekend came and went like a blur. 𝐬𝐻 barely managed to focus enough to get his weekend homework and studying done, but he had to keep at the top of the class. He owed it to himself to work hard. He did manage to put his new figure in place in his room. He moved aside several other figures so that this new one could stand tall right in the center of his collection. Monday morning, he followed his normal routine and made it to school right on time, sliding into his seat right as the bell rang. His homeroom teacher began the day's lessons as usual, but a few minutes and there was an unexpected knock at the door, followed by a very unexpected person entering through it. 𝐬𝐻's new boyfriend was now standing in the door to his classroom. There was a brief round of murmurs through his classmates at seeing the rising star of the first-year hero class standing in their general studies classroom. Excuse me, sensei, I'm sorry for the interruption, 𝐬𝐻 began. Could I borrow his Midoriya for a few moments? Our sensei wishes to speak with him about something. 𝐬𝐻 took note that only two people had caught 𝐬𝐻 almost using 𝐬𝐻's first name, but they were both on friendly terms with him, so he didn't think it would be a problem. He was concerned about why one of the hero course teachers would want to speak with him, though. Of course, Urashi. That's no problem. Just make sure your teacher provides a note excusing the brief absence. Midoriya, go with Urashi. Yes, sensei. 𝐬𝐻 stood and gave a small bow before following 𝐬𝐻 out of the classroom and down the hall towards the hero course section of the building. 𝐬𝐻 couldn't stop his mind from racing, and so he voiced his concerns to his boyfriend. Do you know what this is about? Did they find out about us already? How could they have? Are we in trouble? Oh God, what kind of punishment do they give out for breaking that rule? Is it expulsion? I can't get expelled, 𝐬𝐻. Hey, 𝐬𝐻 cut him off before he could spiral any deeper. He placed a firm hand on his shoulder and gave a brief squeeze before releasing. Calm down, 𝐬𝐻. I do know what this is about and I promise, it's a good thing. You're gonna like it. 𝐬𝐻 eyed the taller boy skeptically, but decided to trust his judgment. Okay. A few moments later, they had arrived outside the door, not to the first-year heroics classroom like he'd expected, but the second-year classroom. This was 𝐀𝐦's class, wasn't it? Along with Nagamasa and Shishikura. 𝐬𝐻 pushed the door open and led 𝐬𝐻 inside. I brought Midoriya like you asked, sensei. Ah, Urashi. Excellent. Their teacher spoke. He was a frumpy-looking man with a strange part in his hair and intense-looking eyes, but he spoke kindly enough. Welcome, Midoriya. Sorry to pull you from your class, but I had an offer I wanted to extend to you. 𝐬𝐻's mind immediately started racing again. What kind of offer could the teacher of the heroics class offer him? He barely even noticed that the classroom was full of hero students, including 𝐀𝐦, who was giving him a knowing smile. Not getting a verbal response from 𝐬𝐻, the teacher continued. You see, I've heard a lot from my students and from Urashi here about your analytical skills, and I've seen some of the notes you've given to them, and I must say, I think they're excellent. You have a real talent here. 𝐬𝐻 was floored. It was one thing for 𝐬𝐻 or 𝐀𝐦 or the other students to compliment his skills, but this man was a professional. He taught aspiring heroes for a living at one of the best schools in the country, and he was impressed by 𝐬𝐻's analysis skills. Oh, thank you, sensei. No, thank you, young man. You've really helped out several of my students with some of your suggestions. The teacher smiled warmly at him. Now, as for the offer I mentioned, I wanted to see if you would come along with us at the end of the week to observe my students. And Urashi, take the provisional license test. It would be a huge help to have you observe the students, as well as the students from the other schools, and get your insights into things that can be improved or changed in their training regimens. So, what do you say? Yes, 𝐬𝐻𝐬 shouted without hesitation, though maybe with a bit too much enthusiasm based on the chuckles that rang through the students he was now all too painfully aware of. 𝐀𝐦 gave him a big thumbs up though, and 𝗀𝐻𝐻 gave him a warm smile, both of which made him feel better. Sorry, yes sensei. I would love to come along and observe. Thank you so much for the offer. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 bowed deeply, not quite with 𝗀𝐻𝐻's forcefulness but still enough to convey his extreme gratitude. No need for all that. We'd be happy to have you. Here, take this note explaining everything to your teacher, and we'll make sure your absence on Friday is excused. The teacher handed him a slip of paper with several sentences explaining the situation to 𝐬𝐻𝐬's own teacher. I think that's all for now, so unless you have any questions, you may return to your normal class. You too, Irashi. No sir, no questions. Thank you again. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 bowed deeply again before turning and leaving the classroom, 𝗀𝐻𝐻 following behind him. He finally let a breath out as he slumped against the wall. Wow, I can't believe this. I get to watch you guys take the licensing exam. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 laughed heartily, again placing his hand on 𝐬𝐻𝐬's shoulder, though clearly wishing he could do something with a little more intimacy behind it. Such was the reality of trying to date at 𝐓𝐡𝐢. You earned it, Zuko. Sensei was extremely pleased with your analysis skills. Thank you for supporting me, I know I've said this before, but you really have no idea how much it means to me. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 spoke softly for just a moment, this time with a definite fondness in his voice. Of course, Zuko. There was a brief moment of comfortable silence before they had to pull apart to head to their respective homerooms. I'll text you later, 𝗀𝐻𝐻. Okay, 𝗀𝐻𝐻 shouted back with enthusiasm. It was hard for 𝐬𝐻𝐬 to believe, given how things had always gone for him in the past, but it really seemed like things were starting to look up for him. The week passed without incident, beyond 𝐬𝐻𝐬 becoming simultaneously more anxious and excited for Friday. When the day finally came, he packed onto a bus with the second-year Hero Course students for the drive to Takoba National Stadium. Since they were seated on the bus by seat number, he actually managed to get seated next to 𝗀𝐻𝐻 since the two of them didn't have seat numbers for this class. Not that they could really take advantage of that in any way, since they had to keep their relationship a secret. The only person who knew was 𝐀𝐦, since she'd more or less maneuvered situations to make it happen in the first place. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 had also told his mom, of course, and she was extremely supportive, both of his relationship and the need to keep it secret from the school. They don't allow student relationships, his mother had said. How silly. Don't they realize it's just going to happen in secret anyway? To everyone else though, the two of them were just good friends who often ate lunch together with 𝐀𝐦. Honestly, no one would assume that the two of them were dating anyway, given the apparent status difference between them. Plus, while the attitude towards same-sex relationships had improved drastically in the last several decades, people still assumed that straight relationships were the default. So, if anything, people would assume 𝗀𝐻𝐻 was dating 𝐀𝐦 long before they thought he'd be dating 𝐬𝐻𝐬. He decided to pull himself out of those thoughts before they got into self-deprecating territory, so he distracted himself by starting up a conversation with his secret boyfriend. So, are you excited for the test? You bet I am. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 always had such energy about him. It was almost infectious, and one of the things 𝐬𝐻𝐬 liked most about him. Good. I'm looking forward to watching you and the other hero students show off. It's rare I get to see you all use your quirks when you're going all out in training. I'll make sure to put on an extra good performance, just for you then. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 had to fight the blush riding into his cheeks. Gee, thanks. Good luck out there. I know you're gonna do great. All of you will. Thanks, 𝐬𝐻𝐬. 𝐀𝐦 called from a few seats back. It's nice that we get, like, our own personal cheerleader. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 blushed again, but he knew she was only joking around. Just do your best, everybody. I'll be sure to have my best suggestions and analysis when you're done. Just then, the teacher stood up and addressed the bus. All right, we're pulling up now. Everyone make sure to grab your costumes when you get off the bus, and we'll head inside to the provided lockers rooms to get ready. Midoriya, you'll stick with me when we get inside and we'll head to the stands to observe. Be on your best behavior, everyone. Nagamasa, I'm counting on you to keep everyone in line and to look after Urashi as well. Nagamasa gave a firm nod. Yes, sir. With that, the bus pulled to a stop behind a line of buses from other schools and they began to file off and gather together just outside. As they were waiting for everyone to get their things off the bus, 𝐀𝐦 came up and whispered quietly to 𝐬𝐻𝐬. So, you two are cute together. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 blushed deeply and shushed her. 𝐀𝐦, come on. You know we have to keep it a secret, or we'll get in trouble. I really don't want to mess things up for 𝗀𝐻𝐻. 𝐀𝐦 sighed. I know, 𝐬𝐻𝐬. I'm only teasing, calm down. Besides, where is your boo right now anyway? 𝐬𝐻𝐬 suddenly spun around to look, and sure enough he couldn't see his boyfriend among the crowd of 𝐓𝐡𝐢 students. Where the heck did he go? Ultra, 𝗀𝐻𝐻's voice carried loudly from near the bus in front of theirs, and 𝐬𝐻𝐬 turned to look and froze completely. 𝗀𝐻𝐻 was currently standing in the middle of a crowd of students from UA High School. He was currently being chastised by Shishikura for barging into their huddle, but 𝐬𝐻𝐬 was barely aware of that, because his entire attention was on spiky ash blonde hair and crimson red eyes that thankfully weren't currently looking at 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿. 𝐀𝐻𝐦 was here. Fuck. This wasn't good. He really didn't want to deal with the fallout if 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐿 saw him here, especially since he wasn't even here as a hero student, but just as an observer. He briefly winced as 𝐸𝐻𝐻 slammed his head to the concrete to apologize for his rudeness, but he'd have to worry about that later. 𝐀𝐻𝐦. He turned and shouted at his best friend. You have to hide me. Use your illusions and make me look like someone else, please. 𝐀𝐻𝐦 looked at him in confusion. Why? What's up, fam? I can't explain now, there's no time. Just please, hide me. I'm begging you. He tried to sound as pathetic as possible and use his biggest puppy dog eyes. Geez, fine. No need to pull out the heavy weapons. I do want an explanation later though. She held up her hand and gave a quick blow and a rainbow mist swirled around 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 before vanishing. And suddenly he looked completely different. He could see in the reflection of one of the bus windows that he was still in the 𝐓𝐡𝐢𝐬 uniform, but he was several inches taller and his face was covered by a mouthless, expressionless black mask with 2 white circles where the eyes would go. It honestly looked like it could be someone's quirk rather than a mask. This would do. He didn't look recognizable in the least, and so felt comfortable going over to join his classmates as 𝐸𝐻𝐻 was finishing his explanation. He couldn't really pay attention to anything that was being said though, or even try to start analyzing any of 𝐀𝐻𝐻's classmates. Since he'd seen them perform in the sports festival, he was too focused on 𝐀𝐻𝐻. He'd grown since last 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 had seen him in middle school, even though it had only been a few months. He'd gotten a little taller and his hero training had clearly filled out a lot more of his muscles. Honestly, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 was glad that 𝐀𝐻𝐦's disguise for him didn't have pupils, because otherwise it would be way too obvious that 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 was blatantly staring at the blonde. Almost as if in response to that thought, 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐿 turned his head and locked eyes with him. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 froze, as if he somehow believed that 𝐀𝐻𝐻's vision was based on movement and if he held perfectly still, then the blonde would move on. As it was, the other boy merely squinted for a moment and then made a TCH sound as he turned away towards one of his classmates, a boy with wildly spiky red hair. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 recognized him from the sports fest as Kirishima, the boy with the hardening quirk. Let's go. Shishikura's bored drawl snapped 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 from his trance, so he turned and started walking with his class. Once they got inside, he heard their teacher speak. Where'd Midoriya go? Oh, I'm right here, sir. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 called. 𝐀𝐻𝐦 let her illusion drop right then so the teacher could confirm his presence and identity. Oh, he said before squinting slightly. Why were you using one of Miss Utsushime's illusions? Oh, it's kind of embarrassing. He rubbed the back of his neck, knocking his cap askew as always. I was avoiding someone who I used to know. I'm sorry, sir. It won't happen again. He hoped. Well, that's fine then, I suppose. He sounded confused, but didn't press the matter further. Come on, let's go head to the stands so we can observe once the test starts. You have your notebooks? Yes, sir. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 happily patted his bag, which had a number of his previous analysis notebooks on the 𝐓𝐡𝐢 students as well as on the UA students he'd seen in the sports fest. He also had his multiple notebooks on 𝐀𝐻𝐻𝐿, since somewhere in the back of his mind he knew there was a chance he'd see his old childhood friend here. Lastly, he had a number of empty notebooks that he'd be filling while he observed today. Good, let's get moving. With that, they set off away from the students towards the stands, and 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 gave a last wave of good luck to his friends and his boyfriend. The first round of the exam was pure insanity, which was appropriate, 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 supposed, since that's what most actual battlefields were like when villains attacked and lives were on the line. There were monitors positioned in the stands so that the teachers could get a closer look at what was going on during the exam. But there were so many students it could be hard to track everything at times. The first thing he'd caught was what apparently happened every year at the licensing exam, the UA crush. Or at least, that's what was supposed to happen. Every year, UA was the first school targeted and were usually decimated, since the other schools already knew their quirks from watching the sports festival. In this case, though, UA had clearly stepped up their game. It unleashed a series of powerful moves that deflected every single ball that had been thrown at them. Not a single UA student had been eliminated in the opening volley. Sensing the fight about to turn against them, one of the Ketsubutsu students had used his quirk to cause an earthquake that split up the entire field and everyone on it, scattering them to the 4 corners of the arena. From there, the chaos truly began. He'd witnessed his boyfriend use the overwhelming strength of his quirk to be the first one to pass by eliminating several hundred students in a single attack. 𝐬𝐻𝐻𝐿 couldn't have been more proud. He'd witnessed the Todoroki boy who 𝐸𝐻𝐻 had mentioned use incredibly smart tactics to outwit a group of ninja-clad students and pass himself. He didn't see anger or hatred in the boy's demeanor at all, but it was hard to read those kinds of things from up in the stands. He'd witnessed several groups of UA students pass as well as several from his own school. Most interestingly, he'd watched Shishikura take on 𝐀𝐻𝐻 as well as Kirishima and the UA boy with the electric quirk, 𝐀𝐻𝐻. He'd done well, but Shishikura made the same fatal mistake that so many did. he underestimated 𝐀𝐦. More specifically, and most surprisingly to Izuku, he underestimated 𝐀𝐦's ability to inspire those around him to do the best they could for others. Izuku of course knew this about the explosive blonde, but it was rare to see it in action with other kids their age. 𝐬𝐻 must really be bringing out the best in 𝐀𝐦. He felt bad for Shishikura, but he knew this was inevitable. He'd heard the boy many times rant about the awful, angry, blonde boy from 𝐬𝐻 who gave the school a bad name and a worse reputation. He'd kept his mouth shut, of course, not wanting to make trouble for himself, but he knew that the other boy had no idea what he was talking about. He didn't understand 𝐀𝐦 at all. Not many people did, unfortunately. But it looked like maybe that was changing, if the way those two boys were following him was any indication. 𝐀𝐦 had many followers and lackeys in elementary and middle school, but this was different. These boys looked up to 𝐀𝐦 in much the same way Izuku always had. Maybe there were others finally starting to understand him. 𝐀𝐦 had managed to pass the first round as well, but she'd somehow managed to do it without Izuku seeing what happened at all. No surprise that the girl with the illusion quirk was hard to track, he supposed. Now it was time for the second part of the exam. Surprisingly, every single 𝐬𝐻 student had made it to the second round, and only a few 𝐓𝐡𝐢 students had been eliminated. They were all now up in the stands with Izuku and the teacher, Shishikura, sulking off to the side and preparing to be extra judgmental of everyone in the second round. This round was focused far less on competing against each other and much more on working together towards a common goal. It was clear right away that the commission had modeled their disaster site after the devastation in 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐸, just with the addition of a few other terrain zones just to make sure they could test the students in a variety of rescue environments. It was honestly going to be a tough exam, particularly for 𝐸𝐻, and probably the 𝐬𝐻 first-year students as well. They haven't even been through a full year of school, so they haven't been through many rescue exercises. Izuku had to fight the urge to cringe a little as he saw 𝐸𝐻 fire up his quirk to go flying into the fray, shouting in excitement. It wasn't exactly the best attitude to have when going to rescue injured and frightened civilians. He'd have to find a way to gently offer that note to him later. Unsurprisingly, 𝐀𝐦 split off from his class to go on his own, but he was followed again by Kirishima and Kaminari. Izuku made note of the close relationship the three seemed to have, since knowing who tended to work with whom was important for analysis. It would also be an interesting exercise to come up with ways their quirks could be used together. Izuku's attention was suddenly drawn to the second-year students, both from 𝐓𝐡𝐢 and the other schools. They all fell into a quick and easy strategy, roping off certain areas, setting up a first aid zone, and clearing a landing pad for helicopter rescue. This wasn't going to be a walk in the park, but this is what heroes did. Oh no, Izuku couldn't fight the urge to slap his hand to his face in embarrassment on 𝐸𝐻's behalf. Didn't he realize that even with the fine control of his quirk that he had, he couldn't just start lifting and moving victims around without checking to see if they were okay? And did he just drop that kid 20 feet into his hand? What the heck was his boyfriend thinking? Off to his right, Shishikura was voicing something similar to Izuku's thoughts, though in a much more condescending way. Fortunately, the teacher was there to remind him that he didn't even do well enough to make it to this round, so Izuku didn't really pay it much attention. The exercise proceeded pretty smoothly from there. Izuku was immensely impressed by everyone's performance after a few initial stumbles here and there. The students began splitting off into smaller groups and moving to areas where their quirks would be most effective. With Nagamasa overseeing him, 𝐸𝐻 was also performing better. And then, everything changed. There was a massive explosion and suddenly 𝐀𝐦 and a bunch of masked figures were charging into the arena. The announcer from the commission was calmly describing a new terrorist attack and instructing students to continue rescue operations while also fighting off the newly arrived villains. They're really having them pull double duty like that. Wow, that's really intense. This scenario rivals something pros might face. And the number 10 hero as a pseudo-villain? That's gonna be a tough fight. Izuku muttered to himself as he observed and continued to take notes. Fortunately, the students reacted quickly. The boy who made the earthquake in the first round jumped in to hold back the minor villains and keep them away from the first aid station. And Nagamasa quickly instructed 𝐸𝐻 to move towards the villains to take them out. A smart strategy given how powerful the boy's quirk was. But it looked like there might be a small hitch in that plan. The 𝐬𝐻 students were sending Todoroki to intercept the villains as well, meaning that if they wanted to succeed, 𝐸𝐻 and Todoroki would have to work together. Given what Izuku knew about his boyfriend's feelings toward the dual-haired boy, he wasn't sure how that was going to play out. He feared not well. His fears had turned out to be right. As soon as the two had shown up on scene, they'd begun to bicker and argue with each other. They had also both used their quirks indiscriminately, which caused both their attacks to be redirected and nullified by the other. The damned fools had even almost gotten the earthquake boy seriously burned by Todoroki's misdirected flames. But fortunately the girl from 𝐬𝐻 with the frog quirk had used her tongue to pull him out of the way at the last minute. She'd also scolded Todoroki and Inosuke for their foolishness, at which point they seemed to finally get their act together and work towards defeating the enemy like they should have done from the beginning. Izuku had been distracted from his frustration, though, by the frankly amazing way they'd utilized their quirks in a combo move that managed to hold Gang Orca back long enough for the last civilians to be rescued. When the dust settled and everyone had gotten changed back out of their hero costumes, so many people had passed the exam, he saw almost everyone from Shiketsu as well as almost every name from UA. The only notable failures had been the ones he'd kind of expected. First was Inosuke and Todoroki, almost certainly for their abysmal teamwork. Next was more unfortunate, which was 𝐀𝐦. With her quirk, she hadn't really been able to do much besides offer basic help at the first aid station. They must have determined that she hadn't done enough to pass. Lastly was 𝐾𝐻. Izuku wasn't really surprised. Even if UA was helping him learn and grow like he suspected it was, the boy was still too aggressive and angry. Honestly, Izuku was kind of upset about that one. Sure, 𝐾𝐻 had an attitude, but Izuku had been watching him during the exercise. He really didn't do anything wrong besides be a little too blunt with the HUC members. He really didn't deserve to be failed just for that. The good news came in the form of the announcement of special remedial courses that anyone who'd failed just the second round could take, at the end of which they'd receive their full licenses just like everyone else. Izuku was so glad for them. It was a second chance that they all really deserved. From what he'd seen, no one who failed the second round deserved to be excluded. They'd all need a bit of additional help, but he could just tell that they would all make amazing heroes one day. Once everyone who'd passed had finished the process of collecting their new license, they'd all gathered back onto the bus for the return trip home. Izuku handed off his analysis notebooks to the teacher for review, as they'd discussed previously, and then took his seat next to Inosuke. "I'm sorry you didn't pass. I still think you did a great job, though." Izuku spoke with as much warmth as possible to try to convey the genuineness of his words. "That's okay," Inosuke replied. He still was speaking in his normal energetic tone, but Izuku could tell it was just the tiniest bit more force than usual. "I screwed up out there, so it's only fair they didn't give me my license." "That's true, you did make some mistakes, but at least they're giving you the remedial course to try to learn from those mistakes." "Exactly. I'm really pumped to go through all of it." Inosuke paused for a moment in thought before continuing in just a slightly more reserved tone. "I tried so hard to keep in mind what you said about Todoroki, but once I saw him I just couldn't get the image of his and 𝐸𝐴𝑉𝑟's hateful eyes out of my head. I just let my emotions take over." "I'm sorry, Izuku. You don't need to apologize to me." Izuku waved his arms in front of himself. "But maybe you owe Todoroki an apology, though. And it wasn't entirely on you, either. He definitely could have handled the whole situation better. But you both came together in the end. And that combo move was amazing. I would love to work with you both on improving it someday. I have so many ideas." "That's awesome. I can't wait." Inosuke was back to his usual levels of excitement finally. "It looks like I'll get my chance to work with him more anyway, since we'll both be taking the remedial course." "Oh, that's a great point. I'll try to write out my thoughts about ways to use your quirks together and give it to you. That way you can work with him on it if you get a chance during the remedial course." Izuku smiled up at his boyfriend. "I'm really proud of you, though, Inosuke. Of all of the students, really, everyone did such a good job, regardless of the final outcome." Izuku really wished he could hug his boyfriend, but he didn't want to take the unnecessary risk. He settled for giving him a comforting pat on the leg as they settled in for the bus ride home. Once they'd arrived and begun offloading everything, the teacher pulled Izuku aside to return his notebooks. "Midoriya, these are amazing. You captured so much detailed information in such a relatively short amount of time. I really think you have a talent here, one we should continue to develop throughout your time at Shiketsu." Izuku's eyes widened. "Really? Of course. I'm going to recommend we modify your class schedule a little bit to have you sit in on some of the heroics classes to observe and analyze. It will help hone your skills, and I think your insights would really help the students grow and learn even faster." Izuku's mouth dropped open. He couldn't believe it. He barely managed to stammer out a reply. "Oh, of course. That sounds amazing. Thank you so much, sensei." The teacher chuckled. "You're quite welcome, Midoriya. We'll talk more about it on Monday. In the meantime, enjoy your weekend." He turned and left, and Izuku was speechless. "Yo, Izuku, that's so rad. Like, what a great opportunity." 𝐀𝐦 came up and threw an arm around his shoulder in camaraderie. "Yeah, it's a great opportunity. I just know you'll do great, Zuko." Inosuke walked up as well and put a hand on Izuku's shoulder in show of support. There was just the smallest bit of affection in it too, an obvious sign that he wished he could do more, give him a hug or a kiss, and Izuku wanted to do the same, truth be told, but they kept themselves under control. "Thanks, guys. It's all thanks to you all and the other students for recommending me so highly. I can't even begin to tell you how much I appreciate it." He sniffed as he wiped away the joyful tears that were beginning to run down his cheeks. 𝐀𝐦 gave him a friendly squeeze before stepping back. Geez, you cry a lot, Izuku, she teased. Izuku laughed mirthfully. I know, it's an old habit. I'm trying to break it, but it may be too ingrained in me at this point. That's okay, Inasa said. It's just a part of who you are. They all smiled warmly at each other before saying their farewells and moving towards their various routes home. Upon arriving home and giving his mother the good news, she insisted on making a big celebratory dinner. It had been a delicious meal with great company as always. He truly didn't know what he would do without his mother's love and support. He knew on some level that she felt guilty for not being as supportive of his hero dream as she could have been when he was first diagnosed quirkless, but he didn't hold it against her at all. And as far as he was concerned, she'd more than made up for it with her support of his life now. Full from his meal and overflowing with happiness at all the things that had been going right for him, he moved to his bedroom and decided he needed to let these emotions out. He hadn't made a video for the channel in a few weeks, given how busy he was with school, so he figured he was overdue. And he knew just the song to sing to let out all the positive emotions that he was fit to burst with. He secured his hoodie and mask, got his setup all ready, and started recording. The drums and brass kicked in hard. He felt the energy flow through him, and he started to sing. For once in my life I've got someone who needs me, someone I've needed so long, for once unafraid. I can go where life leads me and somehow I know I'll be strong. He really loved this song. It had always been one of his favorites. For once I can touch what my heart used to dream of long before I knew someone warm like you could make my dreams come true before. This song had been something to aspire to, something he hoped to one day attain, even when he was at his lowest points in middle school. For once in my life I won't let sorrow hurt me, not like it's hurt me before. For once I have someone I know won't desert me. I'm not alone anymore now, though. It had new meaning to him. It was a feeling he actually felt, a level of happiness he'd actually managed to achieve. For once I can say, this is mine. You can't take it long as I know I've got love. I can make it. For once in my life I've got someone who needs me. As the musical interlude kicked into high gear, he closed his eyes and bobbed his head to the music. He thought of all the amazing things that had happened in his life lately. Getting into 𝐲𝐸, meeting 𝐀𝐦 and Inasa, and making friends, making his channel and helping people with it, dating Inasa, this new opportunity with his quirk analysis, getting to see 𝐀𝐦 and growing into the hero he always knew he would be. At least for once I can say, this is mine. You can't take it long as I know I've got love. I can make it. For once in my life I've got someone. The someone was Inasa. For once in my life I've found someone, but the someone was also the feeling of belonging that he'd finally achieved for the first time in his life. He truly didn't think he'd ever been happier in his life. For once in my life I've got someone who needs me. As the music faded out, he looked into the camera and smiled. Thanks for listening, guys. I hope you enjoyed that. Things have just been going really well for me lately, and I wanted to express even just a bit of that through song. I hope things are going well in all of your lives, too. And remember, I love you all. Thank you. You'll have to do better than that. Shitty hair. Katsuki used an explosion to spin around behind Kirishima, simultaneously dodging his attack and getting in position to launch another explosion into the redhead's back. Aizawa had decided he was too tired to come up with any actual exercises for today's heroics course, so he just told everyone to pair off and do quirk sparring. Katsuki had paired off with Kirishima to continue working on the redhead's endurance while also working on his own dodge and counter skills. Honestly, Katsuki was just looking forward to next week, because they were supposed to have another joint training session with 𝐲𝐸. According to Aizawa, they were going to have some kind of special guest this time, an analysis student of some kind. But honestly, Katsuki couldn't care less about that. He was just excited to have another go at that damn wind bastard. Yue and 𝐲𝐸 had done a handful of these joint exercises since the provisional exams during their first year. A lot of the 𝐲𝐸 kids who'd come in the past, like Glamour Girl and the Meatball Kid, had graduated last year, but the wind bastard was the same year as them, so he would definitely be there. Katsuki had gone head-to-head with him in almost every one of these exercises, and he was beyond frustrated to admit that their record was currently a draw. The bastard just had extremely fine control of his quirk, and it was difficult to maneuver around sometimes. But Katsuki was eager to take the lead next week. With a last booming explosion to Kirishima's midsection, the redhead's stamina finally dwindled to nothing and he fell to the ground and tapped out. Catching his own breath, Katsuki reached a hand out to help his best friend back to his feet. You lasted a lot longer that time, shitty hair. You actually put up something of a challenge. Kirishima smiled wide, understanding by now that that was the Katsuki Bakugo equivalent of glowing praise. Thanks, man. Your dodges are coming along really well, too. I was doing my best to be unpredictable, but I still barely managed to touch you. 𝐶H, you're damn right you didn't. Katsuki couldn't help but smile back, though his was more of a friendly smirk than anything. Alright, that's enough for today. Pack it in and get changed. See you in class tomorrow. Aizawa drawled in his usual bored manner as he curled up into his sleeping bag in the corner of Gym Gamma to take another nap. The class headed out the doors of the gym and towards the lockers to change out of their hero costumes and shower before heading back to the dorms for the evening. On the walk back to the lockers, he noticed Todoroki staring off into space with a weird expression. The half-and-half boy had always been somewhat distant and aloof, but that seemed to have been dialed up quite a bit in the last few months or so. It was frequently like he was in another world altogether, letting himself intentionally slow to fall back next him. Katsuki pulled him from whatever trance he was in. "Boy, icy hot. What the hell's up with you lately? You're always staring off into space like you got hit with brainfucker's quirk or something." Todoroki had the briefest flash of guilt on his face at being caught in whatever daydream he was in, but swallowed it quickly with his usual impassive stare. Katsuki was actually proud to say that he and Todoroki had actually become pretty good friends in the last couple years. They'd gotten off to a bad start, what with Katsuki's anger issues and Todoroki's daddy ones, but now they were actually pretty close in an aggressive but friendly rivals kind of way. In fact, Todoroki was the only person in Katsuki's life besides Kirishima who knew just how much of a bully Katsuki had been in middle school. Neither of them knew the specifics of who it was he'd bullied. That hadn't been the important part, but they knew some of the awful things he'd done. It had been part of his therapy. Open up about his past to the people he trusted. It hadn't been fun, but it actually had helped him feel a little better and come to terms with just how much he'd grown and changed since then. He'd never be a happy ball of sunshine like Kirishima, but he was at least becoming more and more well-adjusted by the day. And as odd as it was to admit, his strange rivalry, friendship with Todoroki helped with that. But anyway, the bottom line was that Katsuki was close enough to his half-and-half classmate that he could actually read his minute facial expressions pretty well, which meant he could tell that the two-tone boy was debating in his head whether to come clean about whatever was going on. "All right, spill it, icy hot. I can practically see the two halves of you fighting in your stupid mismatched eyes. Just tell me what's going on. You promised to keep it to yourself. I don't need everyone else getting in my business too," Todoroki asked with just the barest hint of a raised brow. "Do I look like a fucking gossip to you? I may be friends with Mina, but unlike her, I can actually keep a secret." Todoroki eyed him for a few moments longer before letting out a microscopic sigh. "Fine, it's about the training next week. Or more specifically, who's gonna be there. Is this about your weird crush on the wind bastard?" Katsuki asked without an ounce of tact. He'd seen all kinds of little emotions slip past Todoroki's emotional mask, but he was pretty sure he'd never seen him blush before. Not until today, that was, because Todoroki was most definitely blushing. It was more prominent on the right side of his face because of how his quirk worked, but it was definitely there all around. "How the hell did you find out about that?" the other boy hissed. "Huh, you're not exactly subtle about it. You've clearly had a crush on him since we did those damned remedial courses in first year. And every time you do those training sessions with your quirks, it's all you can talk about for days. Oh god, do you think Ina-san knows?" Katsuki chuckled. "Fortunately for you, you've got a crush on a moron, so no, I don't think he has any idea." "Thank god. I do think he thinks you're pretty alright too, though. The moron is always a giant ball of energy, but he really lets it loose around you more often than not. You should just man up and go for it." Todoroki looked genuinely confused at this. "What? No, that can't be right. He can't like me, and I can't go for it because Ina-san has a boyfriend. He has since first year." "What? That moronic bastard actually managed to get himself a boyfriend? I mean, I knew you liked him, but I figured you were the exception." Shocked, there's two idiots out there dumb enough to go for that dumbass. Todoroki ignored the insults, since he knew as well as Kirishima by now that they were just Katsuki's default way of communicating and he almost never meant them. "Well, I guess there are, because he definitely has a boyfriend. I've met him a couple times actually. He's a nice guy. I think he may even be the analyst student that Mr. Aizawa mentioned is coming next week, but I'm not sure." Katsuki paused to consider. "Well, that blows. Sorry, icy hot." He gave him a friendly but ultimately unhelpful pat on the back before heading into the locker room. "Gee, thanks, Katsuki," he heard Todoroki mumble behind him as he also entered the lockers. Walking up to his locker, Katsuki pulled off the more complicated pieces of his uniform, wiped them clean, and then put them away in their case. He wiped the sweat from his forehead next, then pulled his uniform shirt off before finally pulling open his locker to carefully hang it up inside. He went to tap on his phone screen where he'd left it in his locker during training and nearly froze at the notification he saw there. YouTube 31 meters ago, Deku has uploaded a new video. Ever since he'd stumbled upon Deku's channel thanks to 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐴, Katsuki had developed something of an obsession. He told himself it was just with the nerd's singing voice, but that lie was getting harder and harder to tell himself with every video he uploaded. It was honestly a pretty flimsy lie from the start, considering how many times 𝐀𝐦 had watched each of Deku's videos. Every single one the nerd had uploaded, he'd watched a minimum of 3 times, but there were several of his favorites that he'd watched many more times than that. Deku was extremely talented, and he managed to pour raw emotion into every single song he performed. It was completely mesmerizing, to the point where he'd assume it was the nerd's quirk if he didn't know otherwise. On subsequent viewings of each video, he'd actually managed to learn a few things about Deku's life after moving away. There wasn't much, since Deku didn't say a whole lot during the videos, but there were little pieces here and there. Firstly, and unsurprisingly, the nerd was still a huge All Might fanboy. In his earlier videos, when he was just in his bedroom instead of the mini recording environment from his newer videos, you could see all the crazy All Might merch that littered the walls and shelves behind him. A lot of the merch 𝐀𝐦 recognized from when he and Deku would play in his room when they were kids, but quite a bit of it was new. To 𝐀𝐦's extreme annoyance, the nerd had even somehow managed to get his hands on the limited edition Bronze Age All Might TM figure that had been released during their first year of high school. 𝐀𝐦 had tried so hard to get one of his own, but had been unable to track one down before they'd all been sold. Now, they were collector's items worth way more on the second-hand market than he was willing to pay. The figure was prominently displayed, too, right in the middle of a shelf behind Deku, and could be seen clearly in every video after he got it until he eventually changed environments. He also learned that the nerd was managing to make friends at whatever high school he'd gone to. He knew he had a best friend and that she was a girl, since Deku always referred to her as she whenever he mentioned her, plus a couple other friends who would get mentioned in passing, though never by name. 𝐀𝐦 was honestly extremely glad to learn that. In middle school, he'd seen to it personally that Deku had no friends. He made sure that everyone knew what a quirkless weakling Deku was and ensured it was social suicide to even come close to being the nerd's friend. It was one of the many things he regretted about that period of his life, so it was good to hear that Deku had managed to overcome that in high school. The only other thing he'd learned, or more accurately inferred, was that maybe, just maybe, the nerd was still thinking about him. There was a video from the summer of their first year, in which Deku gave an extremely emotional performance of a song called Ash Like Snow. 𝐀𝐦 hadn't known it at the time, but it had managed to bring tears to his eyes all the same, as had Deku's small speech after the video ended. The thing that he'd noticed later, and that made him think that maybe he had at least a small something to do with that video, was that it was dated just a few days after the 𝐀𝐦 Ward incident, otherwise known as the day he'd been rescued from the League of Villains, the day he'd inadvertently caused the retirement of All Might. Most likely, Deku's emotional state during that song and his thought process around it had much more to do with that, All Might's retirement, than it did with his kidnapping. But he also knew that his name and face had been all over the news while he was kidnapped. Deku had no reason to give 2 shits about 𝐀𝐦. In all honesty, he should probably feel nothing but hatred for him, but some small part of 𝐀𝐦 hoped that Deku had been worried about him. He did his best to ignore that part of himself, but it wasn't an easy thing to do. Overall, he wasn't able to learn much because Deku was being extremely careful about sharing any details in his videos, which was wise given how awful people on the internet could be. In fact, 𝐀𝐦 had ended up taking it upon himself to come to Deku's online defense anytime some asshole or troll would start talking shit in the comments. He'd of course used his alternate account, 𝐀𝐦0715, that he'd made specifically to follow Deku's channel, but he had become a regular there. Sometimes it was as simple as saying shut the fuck up, Deku is amazing, and other times it was a multi-paragraph dressing down of some moron who had the gall to describe why the nerd's singing was bad. Deku himself probably didn't see any of it. Why would he bother reading assholes' comments anyway? The greenette probably had metaphorical steel skin after everything 𝐀𝐦 had ever said to him, so what did trolls online matter? But still, 𝐀𝐦 felt like it was somehow his responsibility to defend Deku. Some small, insignificant way of making up for what an asshole he'd been in the past, even if the nerd would never know about any of it. "Hey, you alright, man?" Kirishima snapped him back to reality with his question. "You kinda spaced out for a minute there." 𝐀𝐦 shook his head a bit, shifting his focus back to his phone, which had by now gone black again, but he knew the notification that waited for him there. "Yeah, fine. Just gonna go use the restroom." He gripped his phone and snatched his wireless earbuds from his locker before making his way into a bathroom stall and locking it behind him. He sat on the lid of the seat, plugged his headphones into his ears, and started pulling up the video. Fuck it, he thought, I've got nothing going on. I'll just watch it now real quick, then head to the dorms. He pulled up the video and turned his phone sideways to get it into full-screen landscape mode. "Cake by the Ocean," he muttered quietly under his breath. "Weird name. Never heard of it." He hit play and was immediately met by Deku's eyes behind his usual mask. But that was where the normalcy of this video stopped. First, he wasn't wearing his normal hoodie. Instead, his green curls were covered by a green wool beanie and he was wearing some other kind of outfit. though 𝐬𝐡𝐚𝐭 couldn't get a good look at it right now since Deku was leaned in towards the camera. The camera was the next odd thing. The angle was slightly higher, as if the camera were sitting on a lower surface than it usually was and had to be tilted up to compensate. This was most likely due to the fact that Deku was clearly in a different location than usual. Once he'd moved on from his bedroom, he'd started singing in some kind of makeshift recording space, but it was hard to tell exactly where it was. The corner of some room, where sound-absorbing foam panels had been set up behind a mic. Now, though, they were in a much larger and more open space. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 could still see the normal mic waiting behind Deku a ways, but the rest of the room looked, frankly, insane. There was a pretty convincing illusion or hologram or something of a calm-looking beach, waves crashing gently into it and the sun shining high above. The only reason he knew it was an illusion of some kind and not an actual beach was that he could see at the edges of the screen the barest hint of where the illusion bled into the normal walls of whatever room the nerd was actually in. "Hi guys," Deku greeted with his usual enthusiasm. Okay, so as you probably noticed, this video is a little different. You see, it's the result of the constant badgering of my best friend. Hey, I don't badger, I request, and you comply. So the best friend was actually in the room with him. That was a first. Deku usually recorded alone, and there was something about the best friend's voice that was familiar, like he'd heard it somewhere before. Deku continued speaking before 𝐬𝐡𝐭 could think on it further. Yeah. Anyway, this one's gonna be a little outside my normal, and outside my comfort zone. He muttered the last bit under his breath, barely getting picked up by the camera's mic. Hopefully you enjoy it, but if you don't, it's her fault. He pointed off camera, presumably at his best friend, and then stood to walk back towards the performance mic. Once his full form was in view, 𝐬𝐡𝐭 practically choked on his own spit. Deku was decidedly not in his usual ensemble of jeans and a fitted hoodie. He was about as far from that as you could get, since he was instead wearing some kind of practically skin-tight leather bodysuit that zipped up the front. Thankfully for Deku's dignity, he had on some sort of cup that prevented his bulge from being too obscene. But the outfit left pretty much nothing else to the imagination. Deku was by no means muscular, but he clearly kept in good shape, given the way the suit hugged every piece of him and showed a lean, healthy figure, the only prominent fat being his still present baby cheeks. As if sensing the eyes of 𝐬𝐡𝐭 and every other viewer on him, Deku had the good sense to blush and look sufficiently sheepish, but he recovered quickly and gave a nod off camera, after which the music started to play. The song started with a low, simple bass line accompanied by a rhythmic clapping, which had Deku lightly bobbing and swaying to the beat, eyes closed before he opened his mouth. "Oh, no, see you walking round like it's a funeral, not so serious, girl. Why those feet cold? We just getting started. Don't you tiptoe. Deku's voice was like nothing he'd ever heard from the nerd before. It was practically sinful, and on the last tiptoe, he looked dead into the camera with a sultry look and just the barest hint of a raised brow. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 felt his breath catch in his throat. Waste time with a masterpiece, don't waste time with a masterpiece. Deku's movements had gone from mildly suggestive to straight up dirty as he did a small pelvic thrust in the air. 𝐬𝐡𝐭's jaw hit the floor. What was going on? You should be rolling with me, you're a real-life fantasy. You're a real-life fantasy, but you're moving so carefully, let's start living dangerously. He grabbed the mic with one hand and reached the other out towards the camera, as if beckoning 𝐬𝐡𝐭 to step through the screen and join him. Talk to me. Baby, I'm going blind from this sweet, sweet craving. Whoa, let's lose our minds and go fucking crazy. Did Deku just fucking curse? I keep on hoping we'll eat cake by the ocean. If 𝐬𝐡𝐭 hadn't already been sitting down, his knees would have gone weak and collapsed out from under him, as Deku began to gyrate his hips, like he was working a hula hoop but in painfully slow motion. Walk for me, baby, I'll be Diddy, you'll be Naomi. Whoa, 𝐬𝐡𝐭 didn't know what the fuck that meant, but right at this second he didn't so much care. Let's lose our minds and go fucking crazy. I keep on hoping we'll eat cake by the ocean. There was that hip gyration again. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 felt faint. What was the old American phrase Kaminari had taught him? Something about clutching his pearls. The music dipped quiet for a moment, and 𝐬𝐡𝐭 briefly was torn between hoping that was the end and hoping that it would never end. He'd never felt so split on something in his life, but it didn't matter because Deku opened his mouth again and continued in that dark, sultry voice. "God, see you licking frosting from your own hands, want another taste? I'm begging. Yes, ma'am, I'm tired of all this candy on the dry land. Oh, just as 𝐬𝐡𝐭 thinks his head might explode if this keeps going. The chorus starts up again and it's more of the same. Deku's sultry voice, the sway and near grind of his body against the mic stand, the deep, almost sinful stares into the camera. It's all too much. And to top it all off, this time the last line of the chorus repeats multiple times, each one accompanied by those stupid gyrating hips, taunting 𝐬𝐡𝐭 with nothing. They taunt him with nothing. He doesn't care. Why would he care about how downright sexy this whole thing is? You're fucking delicious. 𝐬𝐡𝐭 clutches his hand at his chest in shock. which is when he finally remembers that he's not wearing a shirt. He's shirtless in a bathroom stall, watching his childhood best friend perform a routine that might as well be softcore porn as far as Katsuki's concerned. He's now painfully aware of how creepy this looks, but he can't bring himself to stop. One more round of the chorus and then he kicked it into the song's finale, during which his eyes never leave the camera, locked straight on with the viewer, with Katsuki, who also can't look away from those taunting emerald eyes. Red velvet, vanilla, chocolate in my life, confetti. I'm ready, I need it every night. Red velvet, vanilla, chocolate in my life. I keep on hoping we'll eat cake by the ocean. The second the song ended, it was like the spirit of sexy Deku retreated and the normal, shy, awkward Deku that Katsuki had always known took back over. It was almost like an entirely different person was standing at the mic now. It honestly helped Katsuki's brain a little, making him feel like his world was righting itself from the dramatic spin it had just taken. Deku hurried back up to the camera and stammered his outro. Oh gee God, I'm so sorry. That was so weird. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed that, then I'm glad. If you didn't, it's all her fault. A finger pointed off camera at the best friend again. Either way, I'm never doing that again. As always, just remember, I love you all. Thank you. With that, the video ended, and Katsuki was left in stunned silence staring at the recommended videos on his screen. He had no time to gather his thoughts, though, as there was a loud knock at the stall door. Hey, 𝗵𝘃𝗀, you okay in there? Kirishima called from the other side. Why yeah, fuck, was he really stuttering? Yeah, I'm fine, shitty hair. Let a man do his business in peace. Alright, well a bunch of us are going out for ramen tonight, if you want to join us. Yeah, sure. He moved to stand, but suddenly realized that he had a rather obvious problem and immediately sat back down. I'll meet you at the dorms in a minute. Still got a shower. Cool. Don't take too long, though, I'm hungry. Katsuki could hear the pout in the redhead's voice. Yeah. Get a hold of yourself, shitty hair. I'll be there soon. He waited quietly until he heard his best friend's steps echo out of the room and away down the hall, before cautiously poking his head out of the stall door to make sure he was alone. Fortunately, he was, so he was able to shower and finish changing, his erection finally subsiding. Fuck, that was weird, he muttered to himself. Guess I've got some things to figure out. Finally clean and dressed, he made his way towards the dorms to meet his friends for dinner. For the moment, he pushed the now extremely confusing feelings in his head about his former best friend to the back of his mind. But he knew he'd have to confront that particular beast sooner or later. The rest of the week and subsequent weekend came and went, with Katsuki only watching Deku's latest video a dozen more times. At this point, he couldn't deny it anymore. He definitely had a crush on his childhood best friend, the one he'd pushed away all those years ago and then turned angry and even violent towards when he refused to leave him alone. The one he'd told to jump off a roof. Man, he'd been a fucked up kid. And it's not like he was magically a different person now. He'd gone through therapy and was infinitely more well-adjusted than he had been, but he was still the same person as that kid. He had been the one to say and do all those things, not some other Katsuki. So he knew, deep down, that he had no right to have any kind of feelings for Deku, for Izuku, but he still couldn't stop himself. That seemed to be the running theme for his relationship with the nerd, being unable to stop himself from doing things he knew deep down that he shouldn't. He shook the dark thoughts from his head. He didn't have time to worry about this now. Shouldn't be worrying about it at all. Really, since he hadn't seen Izuku face to face in years, and very well might never again. For now, he had to focus on the day ahead of him. It was the day of the joint training exercise with 𝐬𝐻, and the class was all decked out in full hero gear, waiting in the gym for the other school to arrive. Mr. Aizawa stood in front of the class and called everyone to attention. All right, listen up. The students from 𝐬𝐻 will be here shortly, as I told you last week. This time they'll be bringing a student from their general studies course that specializes in analysis, particularly quirk analysis. We'll be going over the details once everyone is here, but the short of it is that today will involve working in small teams to develop different ways to combine your quirk with others for various combo moves. The analysis student will assist with that process. Who is this guy, sensei? Kirishima asked. Have you met him? Aizawa nodded. I have a few times as part of planning this exercise. He's a very intelligent student. But regardless of that, I expect you all to treat him with respect as you would any other visitor to the school. Am I understood? His eyes flashed red as his hair threatened to start floating. Everyone fell silent and gave firm nods of acknowledgement. Good. It looks like they're here. His attention shifted towards the main doors to the gym behind them. The class turned around to look as the doors opened and the 𝐬𝐻 students filed into the gym, led by their teacher with the weird frumpy haircut and the intense-looking eyes. Katsuki smirked as his attention was immediately drawn to the towering form of the wind bastard. But his face immediately fell into stunned silence as he saw the last person he'd ever expected walk through the door. The emerald eyes he'd seen behind that mask as well as countless times in their childhood, the smattering of freckles across those cheeks, and the wild green curls peeking out from beneath the 𝐬𝐻𝐬 hat. Deku, 𝐀𝐦 breathed out so quietly that no one could hear him. So Deku had gone to 𝐬𝐻𝐬. But he hadn't ever seen him in any of their previous joint exercises, which meant he couldn't have been in their heroics course. So was Deku the general studies student 𝐬𝐻𝐬 mentioned, the analysis specialist? Honestly, that made perfect sense. Once 𝐀𝐦 thought about it, the damn nerd had always been writing in those notebooks, watching every hero fight he could get his eyes on, and obsessing over quirks whenever possible. It was no surprise that quirk analysis was something he'd excel at. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't bring himself to look away from Deku as the 𝐬𝐻𝐬 students filed into position across from his class. But for whatever reason, it seemed like Deku was almost intentionally trying to look anywhere but at 𝐀𝐦. He wanted to be mad about that, but honestly he couldn't really blame him. He might do the same thing were their positions reversed. Besides all that, 𝐀𝐦 couldn't help but notice that the nerd looked good. They hadn't been in the same room in almost 3 years. 𝐀𝐦 had obviously seen his videos, but it wasn't the same as seeing him up close and in person. The first thing he noticed, that he hadn't been able to tell from the videos at all, was that Deku had gotten taller. He still wasn't quite as tall as 𝐀𝐦, who'd also hit a growth spurt second year, but he'd shot up a good bit and was probably only a couple inches shorter. The second was that he'd let his curly hair grow out even longer than it had been in middle school. Deku always kept his hair completely covered in his videos, so 𝐀𝐦 hadn't noticed, but it was pretty well grown out now, to the point where it was hanging down the sides of his head somewhat from the weight, rather than sticking straight up and out. It was somewhat covered by the dumb 𝐬𝐻𝐬 uniform cap, but it still looked really good, actually. Before he could ogle the nerd any further, Mr. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 started speaking. "Alright class, welcome back the 𝐬𝐻𝐬 High Hero Course students. Along with them, say hello to Izuku Midoriya from the 𝐬𝐻𝐬 General Studies course." He gestured towards Deku, who gave a small little wave. At least that was familiar. He was still a socially awkward nerd. "Midoriya will be analyzing all of you today and assisting with advice on ways you can match up your quirks with one another. That will be the focus of today's exercise, not any sort of head-to-head competition." He made a pointed look in 𝐀𝐦's direction at this, but he was honestly too distracted to make any sort of reaction. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 seemed mildly surprised at 𝐀𝐦's silence at this announcement, but he recovered quickly and moved on. "Midoriya has already observed most of you either at the sports festivals, at your provisional license exam, or both, so he has some analysis already prepared." "Whoa, seriously?" 𝐀𝐦 interrupted. "That's so cool. What do you have on me?" Deku seemed briefly surprised to be addressed so directly, but recovered quickly. "Oh, you're Denki 𝐀𝐦. Hero name, Chargeable. Quirk, electrification. Your entire body is like a battery, generator, and superconductor of electricity all in one. Controlling the direction of your electrical output is difficult without your support equipment. But I have some theories on that." "Whoa, you had all that off the top of your head?" Mina shouted in amazement. "Is that like part of your quirk or something?" Deku shifted nervously a bit. No, it's not. So what is your quirk, then? Something to help with your analysis or observation?" Uraraka asked. "He's quirkless," 𝐀𝐦 found himself saying before he could stop himself. He regretted it instantly, not because every eye in the room was now on him, but because it was the first time in years that Deku was looking right at him, and the look in his eyes held nothing but hurt. "What? No way," Mina shouted. Deku started, looking again at anything else besides 𝐀𝐦. "Kaken's right. I am quirkless." 𝐀𝐦 felt such an intense sensation of warmth at hearing that childhood nickname for the first time in what felt like forever. He hadn't realized until that moment just how much he'd missed it. Unfortunately, he wasn't the only one who heard it. "Wait, Kaken?" 𝐀𝐦 asked with a mixture of surprise, confusion, and just a hint of mischief. "What a cute nickname. Do you two know each other?" "TCH. Duh." He cut himself off partway through the nickname. He had no right to call Izuku that now. So what if he'd turned it into some positive thing to associate with his singing? 𝐀𝐦 had only ever said that name with aggression and malice before, so what right did he have to say it now? None. He shouldn't even be thinking it. "Izuku and I knew each other when we were younger," he finished with some shame, looking away towards the ground. Izuku seemed surprised to hear his actual name come out of 𝐀𝐦's mouth, but not as surprised as 𝐀�Y's own classmates were at this sudden revelation. "Well, really?" Mina asked in awe. "You're the first person we've met from Blasty's past. Spill, what was he like?" "Enough," 𝐬𝐻𝐬 shouted as his hair and capture weapon floated around his head and his eyes glowed red, silencing everyone in the room and bringing them to attention. This isn't what we're here for. Save it for after class. Once everyone had settled down for a moment, Aizawa let everything fall back into place and got things started. All right, Midoriya, do you have any particular groups you want to start with? Oh, once again, Izuku seemed surprised to be called on, even though he was more or less the guest of honor here. Yes, actually, I already have a lot of thoughts on combinations for Inosuke and Todoroki's quirks since we've worked together before. He paused for a moment in brief hesitation before continuing sheepishly. And if it's all right with him, I actually have some ideas for how to work 𝐀𝐦's quirk into the mix. Fine, Bakugo and Todoroki, go with Urashi and Midoriya. I don't want to hear any trouble coming out of you two, understood? Aizawa asked, but was clearly directing more of the question at Katsuki. They both nodded and started working their way towards an empty corner of the gym as Aizawa continued to give instruction. The rest of you, begin breaking off into groups of 2 to 4 students and begin strategizing about ways to combine your quirks into either offensive or defensive techniques. We'll be coming around observing, and Midoriya will work with each group throughout the day, observing and providing his own analysis. I recommend you heed his words carefully. He's quite good at what he does. Katsuki swore he saw a faint blush in Izuku's cheeks at Aizawa's praise, but he opted to let it go without comment. Izuku had been picked on by him enough for this lifetime. Several lifetimes, in fact. Slightly apart from the 2 Shiksu students, Todoroki stepped up beside Katsuki and gave him a curious look. You two knew each other. Yup. Was he the one you yup? Katsuki was in no mood to go over the details, but clearly Todoroki was smart enough to put 2 and 2 together to get 4. 4 in this case, being that Izuku was the kid Katsuki had told him in Kirishima about, the one he'd bullied relentlessly when he was a kid. Fortunately, Todoroki was also wise enough not to push the topic any further right then, though he fully expected a deeper interrogation later from both him and the redhead. Alright, he cut himself off from the nickname again before taking a deep breath and continuing. Alright, Izuku. What have you got planned for us? There are so many things Katsuki wanted to say, but this wasn't the time. They were here for a purpose, not a heart-to-heart and an apology that was long overdue. It would have to wait for after class. For his part, Izuku seemed unable to help the small smile that played across his lips at hearing Katsuki use his actual name instead of his nickname. Or maybe it was just relief that Katsuki wasn't about to start beating him up right here in the middle of the gym, who knows? Well, I've been working on the fire tornado with Inosuke and Todoroki for a little while now, but with 𝐀𝐦 here, I think we can add something new, an ice tornado. You see, we haven't been able to make one yet, because Todoroki's glaciers have been too sturdy for Inosuke's whirlwind to break apart. Mostly we've just made the wind of the tornado colder. But now, he seemed to pause, as if he wanted the hero students to finish his line of thought. Both Inosuke and Todoroki seemed to tilt their heads in contemplation of this. Seemed pretty straightforward to Katsuki though. Now with me here, I can use my explosions to damage the structural integrity of Icy Hot's glaciers, meaning Baldy over here can break them apart much more easily, right nerd? Katsuki couldn't stop the minor insult from slipping out at the end there, but Izuku didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't mind. He merely smiled wider than Katsuki had seen since elementary school, making something in Katsuki's heart clench tightly. Yup, exactly right, 𝐀𝐦. You guys want to give it a go? Of course, Zuko. That sounds like a great strategy. Let's do it. Lin Bastard shouted with his usual exuberance. Zuko, Katsuki thought. The fuck? I mean, I guess it shouldn't be a surprise they'd be friends. But that was a really affectionate nickname nonetheless. Oh well, at least he doesn't have 𝐀𝐦. That's all me. 𝐀𝐦, you ready to go? Fuck, he'd spaced out. Damn right I am. Let's do this. He grinned wide, punching one fist into his other palm, making a small explosion for emphasis. They spent the next several minutes planning out and then practicing the logistics of the ice tornado. Izuku observed and gave input for a little while, but eventually had to move on to the other groups. By the time he'd circled back around, they'd made great progress, able to get the full whirlwind of icy death going in less than a minute. They still had plenty of room to improve it, but it was a strong move nonetheless. After some more training and tweaking, the day came to an end, and everyone moved towards the lockers to get changed. Katsuki, however, had one last thing he wanted to do. He'd put this off long enough, and who knows if he'd ever get the chance again. He was going to give Izuku the apology he more than deserved. He stood out in the entryway to the gym and took several deep breaths, counted to 10 a few times, did every trick he'd ever learned to keep himself relatively calm. This had to go well. Izuku deserved an apology, and he deserved it without Katsuki turning into a raging prick in the process. Honestly, there was every chance that Izuku wouldn't even forgive him, but that didn't matter. Besides, Katsuki didn't want to read too much into anything, but the nerds seemed pretty pleasant during their handful of interactions throughout the day's training. Everything they'd discussed had been all business, related to the move and technique, but still, Izuku hadn't seemed at all reserved or scared or shy like he might have been in middle school. nor had he been standoffish or mad like might have been if he resented 𝐀𝐦. So maybe, just maybe, there was a chance 𝐬𝐸 would accept his apology and maybe even forgive him. It was a long shot, and more than 𝐀𝐦 dared hope for, but he had to do it anyway. It was what was right. Now he just had to find the nerd. He saw 𝐴 coming in a few minutes behind everyone else, having stayed to help 𝐍𝐲 put away some equipment they'd been using. Oi, glasses, you seen 𝐬𝐸? Midoriya, I believe I just saw him head around the corner in that direction. 𝐴 pointed to the corner of the gym. Why would 𝐬𝐸 go over there? There was nothing over there but a small clearing and some trees. Oh well, didn't matter. He gave a grunt of what might have been thanks to 𝐴 and then headed off in that direction. As he was about to round the corner, however, he heard voices raised in a harsh whisper. Seemed two people were bickering with each other, and not in a friendly manner, though they were making an effort to keep it relatively quiet. 𝐀𝐦 couldn't make out what they were saying at all, just that the tone of both parties didn't sound pleasant, though they did both sound familiar. Knowing he probably shouldn't, he nonetheless kicked into his stealth training and quietly peeked around the corner to see 𝐬𝐸 in a slightly perturbed state and having some kind of whisper fight with the wind bastard, who looked equally exasperated by the whole thing. All at once, several things clicked together in 𝐀𝐦's head. He'd seen couples fight before. He'd seen it with his parents, with Kirishima and Mina, with 𝐴 and Uraraka even. He knew what a bickering couple looked like. They looked just like how Wind Bastard and 𝐬𝐸 looked now. He also remembered his conversation with Todoroki last week, the one where he said Wind Bastard had a boyfriend who Todoroki thought might be the analysis student that was coming along with 𝐬𝐸. The analysis student who turned out to be 𝐬𝐸. Fuck, 𝐬𝐸 and the Wind Bastard were dating. Had been since first year, apparently, if Todoroki was to be believed. And they were currently fighting about something, though 𝐀𝐸 still couldn't hear about what. Honestly, for all he knew, they could be fighting about him. If they'd been together for around 2 years now, then who knows what kind of things 𝐬𝐸 had told him about their past. Maybe Wind Bastard was just finding it all out now and was pissed at 𝐬𝐸 hiding it. Or maybe he was upset that 𝐬𝐸 was making nice with his old bully. There were any number of things they could be fighting about, some related to him and maybe some not. But either way, there was nothing to be gained by 𝐀𝐸 of all people interrupting them mid-quarrel. He turned around and left them in peace, heading towards the lockers to change. He was honestly a fool. He'd actually hoped somewhere in his mind that maybe 𝐬𝐸 would forgive him and want to be his friend. Maybe some deep-buried part of him even hoped that friendship might grow to something more. What an idiot he was. Why the hell would 𝐬𝐸 ever want anything to do with him? He was professional today. So what? 𝐬𝐸 had only ever been polite to a fault. It didn't mean he wanted a walking reminder of his terrible childhood hanging around him. He had his own life to live now. And 𝐀𝐸 just had to face the fact that he wasn't a part of it anymore, and he probably never would be again. Well, maybe this just isn't working out. Yeah, maybe it isn't. It had been a full week, but 𝐬𝐸 was still playing the conversation over and over in his head. He was honestly still playing every fight they'd ever had over and over in his head. Things with 𝐴 had gone really well for a while after they'd first gotten together. It honestly didn't change too much from when they were just friends, mostly because of the rules about 𝐬𝐸 students dating each other. That hadn't really been a problem, though. They got along great as friends, got to see each other constantly at school, have lunch together almost every day, and when schedules allowed go on the occasional date. At some point, though, it stopped being enough. They got to have lunch together almost every day, but they weren't allowed to do anything to express their affection for one another. They didn't behave any differently with each other than they did with 𝐀𝐦. If anything, they ended up being less physical with each other than they did with their regular friends because they wanted to be above reproach and avoid all suspicion. So while 𝐬𝐸 felt no qualms about a friendly hug with his classmates or 𝐀𝐦 or any of his friends in the hero course, it felt like he wasn't allowed to hug his boyfriend because then people might figure out that 𝐬𝐸 was his boyfriend in the first place. It was frustrating, but they made it work. For a time, they'd make extra effort to try to see each other away from school on weekends and go on dates whenever possible. But 𝐬𝐸's busy training schedule in the hero course, plus his internship, made those dates very infrequent. It didn't really start being a problem, though, until their 3rd year. They hadn't realized just how much 𝐀𝐦 had covered for them at school, both with her social charms and with her quirk. She'd find ways to give them small private moments in secluded hallways or empty classrooms, using an illusion to make it look like they weren't there or just standing guard to keep people away. In their 3rd year, however, 𝐀𝐦 had graduated. She was off being a sidekick as pro-hero glamour and wasn't at 𝐬𝐸 anymore to give them cover, which meant what little physical affection they'd been able to show before had shrunk down to almost nothing. On top of that, or maybe because of it, 𝐬𝐸 had started to sense 𝐴 pulling away from him, even in moments where they were definitely alone. If 𝐬𝐸 tried to take his hand or lean in for a quick hug or kiss, 𝐴 would usually pull away or at most give him the barest amount of reciprocation before moving on. whenever Izuku confronted him on it. Inosa insisted that he was just being cautious, not wanting to get caught. Izuku knew this was a real concern, but at the same time, he couldn't help but suspect there was more to it than just that. In fact, it was this behavior that had led to their first big fight, the day that he'd gone with Inosa's class to the 𝐬𝐻𝐸 joint training session. It had already been a stressful day for Izuku because he'd known that he would be seeing 𝐾𝐿 face to face for the first time in years. While he'd seen the blonde at the provisional license test and on TV, at the sports festivals, Izuku was pretty sure 𝐾𝐿 knew nothing of Izuku's life since they graduated middle school. 𝐾𝐿 had done the remedial courses alongside Inosa, but Izuku hadn't told his friends too much about his past. They knew he hadn't had many friends and that he'd been bullied a lot, but he never said anything about the who, so to Inosa, 𝐾𝐿 was just another UA student, albeit an aggressive one. The day of training actually hadn't gone too bad though. Despite 𝐾𝐿 pointing out his quirklessness, UA's hero students were still welcoming of his analysis and suggestions. If anything, they were more impressed with his opinions and skills, knowing that it had nothing to do with a quirk. Even dealing with 𝐾𝐿 had turned out to not be so bad. His childhood best friend had been completely professional, blunt and to the point in a way that was uniquely 𝐾𝐿, but he didn't once say anything mean or put Izuku down in any way. It seemed his time at UA had really helped the boy grow and mature in just the right ways. Izuku couldn't help but be proud. He also couldn't help but be other things, too, that were far less professional and appropriate. A few years of hero training had really helped 𝐾𝐿 fill out in all the right ways. Broad, thick muscles, particularly around his arms and shoulders because the strain put on them by his quirk, thin waist, and defined leg muscles. It was frankly distracting, but he was being considered the guest of honor at this joint exercise, and so he had to act like it. Despite how well it had all gone, it had still been extremely stressful. The only way it could have put more of a strain on him is if All Might himself had shown up. Izuku hadn't seen the former #1 hero since that day on the roof 3 years ago, and he wasn't sure if he could handle another encounter on top of everything else that day. So with all that stress, he'd really just wanted a small moment of comfort with his boyfriend. He'd even managed to find a quiet, secluded corner in the trees away from any prying eyes, and all he'd asked for was just a hug, just a moment, to be held in his boyfriend's strong arms. But Inosa couldn't even give him that. He just spouted the same line about having to be careful not to be caught or they'd be found out and get in trouble. It was the last straw his stressed-out brain could take. It didn't matter if the concern was a valid one. Izuku was just asking Inosa to set it aside for a few seconds to comfort him. That was all. Was that so much to ask? He wasn't proud of the way he'd snapped pretty much that exact sentiment at Inosa. And the whole conversation devolved from there until they were in a whisper-shouting match that probably did more to betray their status as a couple than any hug ever would have. Fortunately, he was pretty sure no one had seen them. They let the fight die without a satisfying conclusion since they had to hop on the bus back home. And since then that same fight or variations on it had kept resurfacing every few weeks, until just last week, when things reached their final breaking point. Izuku had been keeping a dark, jealous theory in the back of his mind for months. But at a certain point in their umpteenth fight, he couldn't hold it back anymore. "It's because you like Todoroki-kun, isn't it?" Izuku bit out. Inosa, for his part, looked taken aback. Izuku was maybe being paranoid, but he felt like his boyfriend had been more surprised that Izuku had caught him on it than he was by the actual content of the accusation. He still denied it though. "What are you talking about, Zuku? You spend more time with him than you do with me at this point. Because we're training, working on the combo move you helped us build together. And I'm interning at his father's agency this year." It was true. Inosa had been interning for 𝗏𝐻𝑒𝑟 this year, having moved past his hatred for the man somehow. Izuku suspected this somehow had a lot to do with a certain boy with bi-colored hair. "Still, I'm your boyfriend, Inosa. You should be able to make time for me. I don't even ask for a lot. And besides, I've seen the way you and Todoroki look at each other and interact with each other. You look like more of a couple than we do." Izuku wasn't sure what he hated more in that moment: the ugly, jealous monster he was letting out or the angry tears that were running down his face. He knew Inosa would never do anything as awful as cheat on him. But that didn't mean that he didn't have feelings for Todoroki. Inosa looked actually hurt by the accusations Izuku was flinging at him. In the days and weeks after this fight, he'd feel genuinely bad about it, but in that moment he was too angry to care. They'd sat in silence for what could have been a few seconds or a whole hour. Izuku couldn't be sure. Inosa looking hurt and sad, and Izuku looking hurt and angry. Eventually, Inosa broke the silence, his voice barely more than a monotone, a stark contrast to his usual boisterous manner. "Well, maybe this just isn't working out." Yeah, maybe it isn't. Deep down, Izuku wished he could have been more level-headed in that moment. Calmly tried to discuss things like the adults they almost were. But that's not what happened. Instead, they quietly finished their conversation, no longer dating, no longer boyfriends. They had broken up. That had been a week ago. And 𝐬𝐡𝐢 wasn't feeling any better about the whole thing. He'd retreated to his room whenever he was home and had taken to having lunch alone. Deep down, he knew that he and 𝐴𝐻 would probably be fine. It wasn't like there was any bad blood between them, but it would be a while before he could be around the other boy without feeling awkward. He also felt an overwhelming sadness. His brain was torn between remembering the fun times he'd had with 𝐴𝐻 and the feeling of inevitably like he'd known this would be coming one day. He was trying really hard not to be too self-deprecating, but he'd always felt like he wasn't really good enough for 𝐴𝐻. He was just a quirkless nobody with half a talent for analysis. But 𝐴𝐻 was a hero all the way through to his core. He deserved someone as great as Todoroki by his side. He shook his head and lightly slapped his cheeks with both hands. He needed to stop this. These thoughts were spiraling out of control. He needed to let his emotions out. So he grabbed the acoustic guitar his mother had gotten him for Christmas last year and set up his camera. No point bothering with the full recording setup for this. He just wanted to get his emotions out. It was honestly a miracle he remembered his hoodie and mask before he hit record. Katsuki was so ready to be done with school. Don't get him wrong. He loved his time at UA and learned a lot, both about being a hero and honestly about just being a decent human being. He was still short-tempered, but he was much better about controlling it when he needed to and about not lashing out at people who didn't deserve it. That said, it was just a few weeks until graduation and he was ready to get the hell out of here and start doing the job he was made for. He already had everything laid out and ready to go. He'd been offered sidekick positions with a number of the top heroes and had been tempted to accept a few of them. But he was ultimately taking the road less traveled. As with anything in his life, he was going to approach being a hero the Katsuki Bakugo way, which meant he wasn't going to be anybody's sidekick. Nope, he was gonna do the reckless thing and open up his own agency. His parents had very generously provided the startup funds required to get a small building on the outskirts of Tokyo and to procure all the proper permits and licensing. And the entire Baka squad had signed on to be his sidekicks. Honestly, them being his sidekicks was really just a formality, since a hero agency led by a team of 5 people was bound to be a bit unwieldy. So they'd all decided to make him the big man in charge. And so they decided to form the Dynamite Hero Agency upon graduation. Honestly, he was glad to have them being sidekicks, because it meant he didn't have to worry about the bullshit minutiae like hiring HR reps and support techs and analysts and all that other shit. He left Zero in charge of all that. Zero had tried to talk to him exactly once about some garbage about someone he was considering for their main HR rep and hiring manager, but Katsuki cut that shit out quick. If they've got good qualifications and you like them, hire them. Otherwise, kick him to the curb. Either way, don't bother me with it. Pretty much everything was coming along well too. He was moving into a decent apartment near their agency along with Kirishima and Mina. The agency was ready to open for business 2 days after graduation. All they had to do was actually make it to graduation. Aizawa wasn't going easy on them just because their schooling was almost over. If anything, he was pushing them harder in these last few weeks than he had the entire rest of their time combined. But it honestly was to be expected. The man just wanted to make sure his students were as ready as they possibly could be. Katsuki respected that. Besides, after a rough day of training, he still had his guilty pleasure to fall back on, watching Izuku sing. He hadn't seen the green-haired boy in person since the joint training session. Todoroki had invited him to come practice the ice tornado with him and 𝐴𝐻 and Izuku, but Katsuki always came up with an excuse. He didn't want to be the possible cause of any more strife in Izuku's life or his relationship, so he'd politely excuse himself from it. That didn't mean he had to stop watching the nerds' videos though. That was still a joy he allowed himself. Honestly, he couldn't stop himself if he tried. He was just too drawn to Izuku in ways he couldn't even begin to understand. He was just settling into his dorm room after a particularly harsh day that left him with more than a few bruises, ready to listen to his favorite of Izuku's older stuff, when he saw the alert from YouTube. YouTube 3 days ago Deku has uploaded a new video. Fuck, he must have missed the notification on his phone. He was pretty wiped after training and hadn't bothered to even look at the thing before tossing it into his bag, immediately forgotten. But now he had something to unwind with. A new video was always a treat, especially in this last year. Izuku had been posting less frequently in the last several months. Katsuki assumed it was because he was going through his own end of school hell over at Shiketsu. Katsuki settled into his desk chair, put on his headphones, and hit play on the video, ready to listen to it on repeat while studying if it was good. Almost immediately, Katsuki recognized that something wasn't quite right. There were a lot of obvious signs. First, this was the first video in a long time that was back in Izuku's bedroom rather than the recording environment he'd set up for himself. Second, Izuku was holding an acoustic guitar. He'd never provided his own instrumentation before, always used backing tracks of some kind or other. On its own that wasn't a problem. It was pretty cool in fact, but there was something about it right now that seemed off. Third, the limited edition Bronze Age All Might M figure that had sat in the middle of Izuku's shelf in full view of the camera in his earlier videos was gone. There was nothing standing in its place. It was just an empty void in the middle of all his other figures. Lastly was the least obvious sign to casual observers, but to Katsuki it might as well have been painted in giant letters on Izuku's face. His eyes were incredibly sad. He almost looked on the verge of tears to Katsuki, and he should know, having seen Izuku crying many times. Before Katsuki could process any further, Izuku let out a quiet sigh and started to strum at his guitar. A slow, somber melody began to fall from the instrument like water beginning to slip through the cracks in a crumbling dam. After a few bars, Izuku began to sing. It was a sound unlike any Katsuki had ever heard from Izuku's lips. It wasn't just sadness. It was melancholy. It was sorrow. I heard there was a secret chord that David played and it pleased the Lord, but you don't really care for music, do you? Well, it goes like this: the fourth, the fifth, the minor fall, and the major lift, the baffled king composing hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. What the hell happened? Izuku was still wearing his hoodie and mask like always, but the emotion was still written all over his face. His eyes were screwed tight as if trying to hold back the tears that wanted to flow. Well, your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof. Her beauty in the moonlight overthrew you. She tied you to her kitchen chair. She broke your throne and she cut your hair, and from your lips she drew the hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Hallelujah, hallelujah. Katsuki had seen Izuku cry. He'd seen him upset in countless different ways. He'd seen him indignant, and he'd even seen him righteously angry. But he'd never seen this before. Katsuki felt his heart squeeze in his chest. He'd been trapped and suffocated by a monster made out of sludge before, but still, this was the most helpless he'd felt in his entire life. Baby, I've been here before. I've seen this room and I've walked this floor, you know. I used to live alone before I knew you, and I've seen your flag on the marble arch, and love is not a victory march, it's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. It was in that moment, as he watched the tears finally slip out around his eyelids, as he listened to Izuku's voice break, just ever so slightly, as he sang the words cold and broken hallelujah. That was when it clicked for Katsuki. This was heartbreak. Someone had broken Izuku's heart, and Katsuki was probably going to have to kill them. Izuku continued on into the next verse, but Katsuki was distracted. There was nothing else this could be. He and the wind bastard must have broken up, and Izuku wasn't handling it well. That bald motherfucker. How dare he? Did he not fucking see what a fucking treasure he was throwing away? Any fucker would be goddamn lucky to be Izuku's boyfriend. And this motherfucker was just tossing it away like it was nothing. He took a deep breath and counted to 10 before he lost control of his quirk and set off the dorm's fire alarm. Again, he managed to bring his focus in again in time for the final verse of the song. Maybe there's a God above, but all I've ever learned from love was how to shoot somebody who outdrew you, and it's not a cry that you hear at night. It's not somebody who's seen the light, it's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. And then Izuku was repeating the final refrain of hallelujah over and over. The tears were flowing freely now, slipping over his mask, but it didn't ruin the effect of the song. If anything, it strengthened it. Izuku poured all his emotions into these final hallelujahs. Katsuki had never heard anything so heartbreakingly beautiful before in his life. And through it all, he didn't let a single note falter from the guitar. It was like his fingers had a mind of their own, focused only on keeping the music going. By the time the final, long-held note drifted off, Katsuki had a tear in his own eye. On the screen, Izuku let out a long breath before wiping the tears from his eyes with the sleeve of his hoodie. I'm sorry guys. As credit to the nerd's never-ending endurance, he chuckled. It was the saddest laugh Katsuki'd probably ever heard. But it was still a laugh. This is gonna sound so emo of me, but my boyfriend and I broke up last week and I just needed to let my emotions out. I know it's not exactly the fun and joyful stuff I usually do, but it was something I needed. Feel free to give it a miss if you didn't like it. He took another breath, this one deep and shaky. Just remember, I love you all. Thank you. And then the video was over. Katsuki sat staring at the recommended videos for who knows how long before he finally came back to his senses. And by came to his senses he meant was filled with indignant rage. He knew what was most important now though. As much as he wanted to blast his way to the other side of the country and blow up Baldy's fucking face, Izuku needed support more. The problem was he couldn't exactly give it himself, at least not directly. There was every reason to believe that Katsuki may have had some small role to play in the breakup. And even if he didn't, Izuku had no reason to want any kind of comfort and support from the guy who'd made his life hell for so many years. But Katsuki wasn't gonna just sit there and do nothing. Fortunately, he had made his throwaway 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐴 account that would work perfectly. A comment didn't seem like enough though. Who knew if Izuku even read his comments? Katsuki certainly fucking wouldn't. He could message him directly, but fucking YouTube didn't have a direct messaging system. Letting out a great sigh, he downloaded Twitter onto his phone, something he'd sworn never to do, and started creating a throwaway account by the same name. A notification. is here. Izuku was roused from his pseudo-nap by the sound of All Might loudly announcing that he had a notification on his phone. Recording that video earlier had been cathartic in a way. It let him release a lot of his pent-up emotions surrounding his and Inasa's breakup. But it also kind of broke the dam of those emotions. He'd had to edit and upload the video through his tears and then immediately collapsed into bed, still in his hoodie, to pass out for a few hours. He rolled over in bed slowly, his eyes crusty and gross, probably red from crying so much. Sometimes he hated how much of a crybaby he still was, despite being basically an adult at this point. He sighed and grabbed his phone to see what the universe wanted from him now. Twitter 1 meter ago, new direct message request from @𝐀𝐦0715. Izuku sat bolt upright in his bed. Kem, he was getting a DM from 𝐀𝐦0715. Izuku of course knew the username. He'd never wanted to reply to any comments on his videos, mostly because he'd been too shy to engage, but also because he feared being messed with by trolls. But he couldn't ever stop himself from reading every single one. 𝐀𝐦0715 had started leaving comments a little under a year ago, around the beginning of 3rd year, but whoever they were, they'd quickly watched and left comments on every single one of Izuku's videos. And they didn't stop there. They picked a fight with every single commenter who ever said anything even remotely negative about a video, and left glowing praise on every new video he uploaded. Honestly, Kem had been a huge source of motivation for Izuku without ever intending to. Whenever he'd felt down or discouraged about his abilities or the relevance of his videos, there was a comment from Kem telling some troll to shut the hell up because Deku's amazing. Either that or they were just commenting on a new video saying, "Deku, your fucking voice is like a dropkick to my gut in the best fucking way. Don't ever fucking stop doing this, and don't ever let any motherfucker tell you that you ain't worth shit. They're just jealous little bitches." Honestly, they were a little vulgar, but Izuku didn't really mind it. It was honestly kind of charming when that kind of language was used in defense and support of him, instead of to put him down like 𝐀𝐦 used to do. Honestly, a lot of Kem's language reminded him of 𝐀𝐦, but that was ridiculous. Izuku couldn't even imagine what the blonde's reaction would be if he found Izuku's channel and figured out it was him. But whoever they were, Izuku really appreciated Kem. He was a little embarrassed to admit that he'd actually tried to cyberstalk the username. He'd come up empty though. He couldn't find a trace of that username anywhere else on the internet, just in the comments of his videos. But now he was getting a Twitter DM from that username. He opened the app and accepted the message request. @𝐀𝐦0715, your boyfriend is a fucking idiot. Any guy would be lucky just for a chance to date you, so anyone who'd let you go is a fucking moron. Fuck, I hope that's not too forward of me, you don't even know who I am. Fuck, I can't figure out how to unsend this. Well, this is awkward. Izuku couldn't stop the joyous laughter that bubbled up out of his throat. It was the first time he'd genuinely laughed since before the breakup. This guy was actually doing a great job of cheering him up a little, even if it wasn't in the way he maybe intended. Deku sings haha. Thanks, that actually means a lot. And you did manage to make me laugh, so, yeah, thank you. @𝐀𝐦0715, oh well. You're welcome. Deku sings also, thanks for all your comments on my videos. I know I don't ever reply, but I've read every single one. It means a lot to have you supporting me. @𝐀𝐦0715, fuck. That's fucking embarrassing. I didn't think you'd ever read those. Deku sings, well, I did. Grinning face with smiling eyes, and you don't have to be embarrassed. It was actually really nice having someone be so enthusiastic in their support of me. Besides, you're basically my #1 fan. @𝐀𝐦0715, damn right I am. Anyway, I gotta go. Study time. Just remember what I said. Your ex is a moron if he can't see how fucking great you are. So pay him no fucking heed. Got it, Deku? Wow, this guy really was a lot like 𝐀𝐦. Somewhere in the deepest corners of his mind, thinking that it was true made him smile just a little bit. Deku sings, okay, Kem. I'll keep that in mind. Also, feel free to message me if you ever want. I'm not one for talking to my fans since I'm way too awkward, but I think I can make an exception for my #1 fan. There was a decent-sized pause before Kem replied. Had he gone too far? Was he being socially inept again? Had he just ruined the first positive social interaction he'd had in weeks? @𝐀𝐦0715, yeah, same to you. Message me whenever. Izuku let out a sigh of relief. Kem was right. If Inasa couldn't see the value in their relationship, then it wasn't worth getting torn up about. He just needed to pick himself back up and keep moving forward. He had graduation in a few weeks and then he was off to college at the University of Tokyo. He had a dream to fulfill and he was going to see it through, no matter what. Halfway across the country, Katsuki had a giant grin on his face. He couldn't help it. He was almost giggling to himself alone in his dorm room. He'd almost said too much and given away his identity, which would have been extremely awkward, but that didn't matter. There was only one thing that mattered at that moment. I made Izuku laugh. This song is dedicated to everyone graduating this week. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was back in his regular recording space and in his normal get-up, as each of us goes out into the world. Whether we graduate from a hero course or a support course, general studies or business, a tech school or a fine arts school, whether we're heading off to a new career or off to university. This song is dedicated to each and every one of us, myself included. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 used the remote in his pocket to start the music. The melody built to a crescendo, and 𝐬𝐻𝐸 started to sing. Can you hear my heartbeat? Tired of feeling never enough, I close my eyes and tell myself that my dreams will come true. His own graduation ceremony had concluded earlier that day. It had been an inspiring day where 𝐬𝐻𝐸 himself had been given the honor of making the valedictorian speech. He honestly wished he could have sung it. He might have been less nervous that way. There will be no more darkness when you believe in yourself. You are unstoppable where your destiny lies. Dancing on the blades, you set my heart on fire. As it was, he got through the speech all right. He spoke about the hopes and dreams each student carried within them. Dreams that their time at 𝐀𝐦 had helped them build towards and shape. Dreams they would now go out into the world to make into a reality. Don't stop us now. The moment of truth. We were born to make history. We'll make it happen. We'll turn it around. Yes, we were born to make history. Born to make history. Born to make history. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 had been immensely grateful for the fact that 𝐀𝐦 held separate ceremonies for the different courses, which meant he'd been able to completely avoid an 𝐴𝐴. There wasn't any animosity between them, but things were still entirely too awkward, and more than a little painful. As he sang through the chorus a second time, he let his body move to the music, focusing on the positive feelings surrounding the day and his eagerness to move forward into the future. Can you hear my heartbeat? I've got a feeling it's never too late. I close my eyes and see myself how my dreams will come true. Despite the last few weeks and how complicated they had been for 𝐬𝐻𝐸's personal life, he still felt nothing but hope for the future, not just for himself, but this entire generation. There were so many bright and intelligent people he'd met during his 3 years, all of whom he just knew would find success out in the world. He also knew most of the hero students at UA and had worked with them enough times to know that they had more potential than almost any graduating class of heroes he'd ever heard of. There will be no more darkness when you believe in yourself. You are unstoppable where your destiny lies. Dancing on the blades, you set my heart on fire. And, of course, it was also 𝐀𝐻𝐸's graduating class. He was a born leader. Always had been, and 𝐬𝐻𝐸 knew in the depths of his soul that 𝐀𝐻𝐸 would be the most amazing hero the world had ever seen. Don't stop us now. The moment of truth. We were born to make history. We'll make it happen. We'll turn it around. Yes, we were born to make history. Born to make history. He was planning to follow the blonde's career closely, already setting up alerts in his news feeds for any updates regarding 𝐀𝐻𝐸's hero name and the name of his agency. He already had a few, since it was big news for UA's most promising graduate to skip straight to opening their own agency. Even 𝐸 𝐍𝐸's personal protege, had gone the sidekick route for a year before opening his own agency. But 𝐀𝐻𝐸 was anything but predictable. He did things his own way and exploded anything that got in his way, figuratively and oftentimes literally. Born to make history. Don't stop us now. The moment of truth. We were born to make history. We'll make it happen. We'll turn it around. Yes, we were born to make history. 𝐬𝐻𝐸 was even hopeful about his own dream and his own future. Through his work with 𝐀𝐦, he'd decided that he wanted to go into the field of hero analytics. It wouldn't be easy, though. Hero analyst was an extremely sought-after position. Only the biggest hero agencies could even afford to employ them, and the few spots they did have were usually reserved only for those with the most impressive observation and analysis quirks. Don't stop us now. The moment of truth. We were born to make history. We'll make it happen. We'll turn it around. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He was going to do everything in his power to make his dream happen. He had already been accepted into the University of Tokyo and was going to pursue a double major in analytics and hero studies. It would be a tough curriculum, but he knew he was up to the challenge. He was even willing to start at the bottom after graduating from university, working in an entry-level non-hero-related analysis position and work his way up, something many prominent hero analysts had done in the past. Yes, we were born to make history. We were born to make history. We were born to make history. Yes, we were born to make history. As he belted out the final note and the song came to an end, he couldn't stop the wide smile from spreading on his face. He walked over to the camera to give his closing message. To each of us who are graduating now, let's go out there and show the world what we've got. He let his smile morph into his most 𝐀𝐻𝐸esque smirk. They're not gonna know what hit him. Remember, I love you all. Thank you. The subsequent 6 months passed by for 𝐬𝐻𝐸 in what felt like a blur. As soon as his freshman semester started, he was immediately inundated with work. Doing a double major of any kind and at any university was already a heavy load. But the hero studies and analytics programs at the University of Tokyo were the best of the best, and they really demanded almost all of his time and attention. He had known this was going to be the case, but a part of him hadn't been fully prepared for exactly what that was going to involve. He hadn't seen any of his friends since graduation. And because he'd moved into the university dorms, he hadn't even seen his mother since he started school. He missed all of them terribly, and felt a little bad for being so unavailable. But the handful of times he'd managed to communicate with them, they were always very supportive and understanding. His mother in particular was always overflowing with pride for his accomplishments, usually tearing up by the end of a conversation, leading to Izuku tearing up a little as well. The only person he had managed to keep in slightly more regular communication with was 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐸 through their DMs on Twitter. He still had no idea who the other man actually was, but he'd learned a few things. He'd gotten confirmation that 𝐀𝐦 was, in fact, a guy. He'd learned they were about the same age, since he'd graduated at the same time as Izuku. He'd learned that he hadn't gone to university after that, instead going straight into running his own business, doing something in public service, though he hadn't been more specific than that. And he learned that, whatever he did for a living, it kept him just as busy as Izuku was with school. Because of this, they'd been able to communicate sporadically, sending a message whenever either of them was free, with no expectation of an instant reply. It meant they didn't have to worry about upsetting the other by not responding fast enough. And because they both tended to keep odd hours studying and working, they didn't have to worry about sending a message too late at night. In a weird way, despite not actually knowing too terribly much about him, 𝐀𝐦 had become one of his closest friends since starting university. It wasn't like they talked constantly, but they did talk consistently, which was more than could be said for any of his other friends. Izuku had taken to just calling him 𝐀𝐦, mostly just to avoid having to capitalize the letters every time, and 𝐀𝐦 continued to just call him Deku, which honestly only served to remind him more of 𝐾𝐻, something he was actively trying not to do. It wasn't fair to compare 𝐀𝐦 to some stranger he'd never met. Izuku had asked him once what 𝐀𝐦 stood for, but he'd only replied their initials and left it at that. Izuku assumed they were his real initials and opted not to press further, since they hadn't yet revealed their real names to one another. Izuku's thoughts were abruptly returned to the present by the sound of All Might announcing a notification on his phone. Speak of the devil. That's probably 𝐀𝐦, Izuku muttered to himself. He reached out to grab his phone off of the desk in his bedroom but was surprised by the name on his phone. Oh, it's 𝐀𝐦. Izuku felt truly bad about how out of touch he'd become with his best friend. They hadn't seen each other in person since before his breakup with Inasa. She desperately wanted to attend both of their graduation ceremonies, but had been forced out of the country on a mission. By the time she'd returned, school had started for Izuku and the two of them had been too busy to make time to meet up. They'd barely had time to communicate at all, really. 𝐀𝐦 Izuku, have lunch with me today. I have the day off. Izuku looked over to the pile of homework and study materials on his desk, interspersed with several open textbooks. It was a Saturday, which meant he had no class, but he did have a lot of studying left to do before Monday. Izuku, hey, it's been too long. I don't know if I can today. I have a ton of homework. Crying face plus. I have a test Monday I need to study for. 𝐀𝐦 Izuku, calm down. You have to eat at some point, right? Right. So meet me for lunch in an hour. I won't take much of your time. We just haven't seen each other in like forever. I know this place that's close to your campus, so you shouldn't have to go far. Okay, cool, see you then. There was one more message containing a GPS pin of a little cafe that served sandwiches and things and was just a few minutes walk from his dorm. Knowing 𝐀𝐦, she'd silenced their chat thread so that he wouldn't be able to respond and back out. He let out a sigh and let his head fall onto the back of his chair. She does have a point, I guess. I do have to eat at some point. As if in agreement, his stomach chose that moment to give a low grumble. He stared down at it like it had betrayed him. All right, fine, I'll go. It will be nice to see 𝐀𝐦 again, after all. With a huff of exertion, he threw himself out of his chair and made for his dresser to change clothes. Despite being given an hour's notice and only being a few minutes away, Izuku still somehow managed to be 5 minutes late to meet 𝐀𝐦. He hurried himself into the cafe nearly out of breath and started scanning the tables, but didn't see her anywhere. He briefly wondered if she'd already left once she saw that he was late. Then he noticed a weird boy around his age sitting alone at a table and waving excitedly at him. He'd never seen this boy in his life, but he still looked somewhat familiar. As he stared at the stranger, he realized that he could almost pass for 𝐀𝐦's twin brother if she'd had one. Izuku, the boy was shouting, but it was with 𝐀𝐦's uniquely familiar voice. Finally, it clicked. She was using an illusion to disguise herself so as not to be recognized or bothered. He let out a sigh of relief and then moved to sit across from his best friend. Hey, sorry about the disguise. 𝐀𝐦's voice intoned from the illusory young man across from him. I love my fans and everything, but sometimes it can be super annoying to have them harassing me if they spot me. Besides, I want to spend this time catching up with my best buddy. Thanks, Izuku chuckled with an awkward smile. I don't think I could have handled your fans attacking you while I'm sitting here. No sweat. She leaned over the table and pulled him into a big hug. I missed you, fam. It's been, like, way too long since we talked. Finally, she settled back into her seat with a smile that was most definitely 𝐀𝐦, even if it was on this unfamiliar face. "How have you been, college man?" "I've been good. Honestly, classwork and studying takes up almost all of my time, so there really isn't a whole lot to report. You know me, I was never really a social butterfly without." He paused for a moment. "Without you and Anastasia dragging me out to do stuff," he finished lamely. The server, clearly not able or not willing to read the mood, chose that moment to approach and get their orders. They both quickly ordered their lunch, and the waiter left, the air between them silent for a moment. "Yeah, we haven't really gotten to talk since then. You okay?" 𝐀𝐦 asked, her hand falling on top of his and her voice nothing but sympathy and compassion. "Yeah, I'm okay. The breakup sucked, and I took it hard for a little while, but honestly, I've made peace with it. Still haven't been able to talk to him at all, though." He chuckled nervously. "You see him during patrols and stuff, right? How is he?" "He's doing okay," 𝐀𝐦 answered with few words. Since 𝐀𝐦 was never one to use few words, he was immediately suspicious, but he had a solid clue as to why. "𝐀𝐦, it's fine. I'm friends with enough of the UA kids to hear things. I know he and 𝗪𝗏 just started dating. It's really okay. I'm happy for him. Both of them." He tried to put on his most convincing smile. "I just want to make sure that he's really doing okay, you know." She gave him a pitying look for the briefest moment, but tucked it away quickly. "He's doing fine, 𝐬𝐸. He was pretty broken up after you two split, but he came to the same conclusion you have and I have. You two weren't really a super great couple. Those dumb 𝐬𝐸 rules probably have a lot to do with that, but you two are just great friends, and once you get past the awkwardness of the breakup, you'll go right back to it. Yeah, you're right. Thanks, 𝐀𝐦. I'm glad he's doing well, and honestly, he and 𝗪𝗏 will be good for each other, I think. 100%. You are allowed to be a little jealous though, you know." She gave him a teasing look. He laughed good-naturedly. "Yeah, I know, but I promise I'm fine. Really, right now I'm just feeling more lonely in general than anything." "Totes, that's understandable, cause like just about all of your closest friends are newly minted sidekicks and pro heroes, which leaves like no free time, and you're super busy being a mega genius at college and getting those double degrees. I imagine it's tough to see anybody." "Yeah, it is. I haven't even had time to keep up with the channel. A lot of my followers are really wanting a new video, but I haven't posted anything since graduation." "True, but that song fucking slapped, 𝐬𝐸. Your fans should be satisfied for a while. Besides, the whole point was to make you feel good and let you do something you enjoy, but you gotta focus on school and stuff too." "You're right. I do want to do something soon though, if I can find the time." He let out a little sigh, hoping he wasn't about to sound childish. "I miss my mom too. I feel bad, leaving her all alone back home, and I've pretty much always had her to come home to." "For sure. Your mom is, like, totes the best. Tell her I said hey the next time you talk to her." "I will. Honestly, I feel even worse about it, because with the dual degree I don't have any time for a part-time job, which means she's having to keep working extra hard to help pay my tuition. I mean, it's a public university so it isn't crazy expensive, but it isn't cheap either." "Yeah, I imagine so. You know I'm happy to help you out if you..." He held up a hand to stop her. "I know, and I appreciate it, but I can't accept that. It's not like you're raking in the cash just yet as a sidekick. And Tokyo is expensive to live in. I'm doing fine. I just feel a little guilty making my mom work so much." "Well, first off, I know your mom would tell you that you aren't making her do anything. She loves you and wants to support you." He blushed and looked down to the side, knowing that she was right. "Second off, that's fine. Just know that I'm always here to help you if you need it." She gave a big warm smile, briefly letting her illusion flicker off so he could actually see her instead of the boy she was disguised. "Third off, I'm paying for lunch." He waved his arms in front of him in protest. "𝐀𝐦, no. You don't. Shut it, 𝐬𝐸. I'm paying, so get over it. Now, tell me about your classes. Any cute boys?" She gave a teasing smile and they fell into a natural rhythm of conversation. It reminded him a lot of their days in the 𝐬𝐸 cafeteria, gabbing away about anything and nothing at all. The waiter brought out their food a short while later, and they enjoyed lunch together, spending time continuing to catch up. He talked about his classes and she about some of the missions she'd been on and, most interestingly to 𝐬𝐸, some of the quirks she'd gone up against. It was the best lunch he'd had in quite a while, and he was immensely grateful to have 𝐀𝐦 as his best friend. She could be goofy and airheaded at times, but she always knew exactly what to say and do to make him feel better. True to her word, 𝐀𝐦 paid the tab, despite 𝐬𝐸 protesting. Several more times, they said their goodbyes, gave a big hug, and 𝐬𝐸 headed off towards campus, back to his dorm to study. The last year and a half since graduation had been a whirlwind of chaos for 𝐀𝐦. He'd had to hit the ground running with his new agency, figuratively and literally, since his first patrol had ended with him chasing a speed quirk villain through downtown Tokyo for 20 minutes. He'd managed to bag the guy, and it had made for some great opening publicity, but it was exhausting. Every day was at this point, having to balance patrols, missions, and paperwork. As he'd been warned many times before, it left him basically no time for any kind of social life. Every day after work, he'd go back to his modest one-bedroom apartment, cook himself the fastest dinner he could, and then immediately pass out. Even his days off were mostly spent filling out paperwork he'd put off during his work shifts, working out to make sure he stayed in top shape, or just sleeping more. Aside from the very occasional bar night with the Baka squad, his only enjoyment outside of work revolved mostly around 𝐬𝐻𝐬. If he wasn't watching one of his old videos, he was chatting with him online under his 𝐀𝐦 alias. At Deku sings "Hey Kem, how's it going? Speak of the devil." He was in the locker room of the agency, changing out of his hero costume, getting ready to head home for the day, so he snatched up his phone from his locker to reply. At 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐶 Deku, you have good timing. Was just getting off work. Great job on the video the other day. Phenomenal as always. 𝐬𝐻𝐬 hadn't posted a ton since the performance of History Maker he'd done the week of graduation. From what he'd gathered, the nerd was busy doing a double major in college and hadn't had a lot of time to record new content. Just yesterday, though, he'd uploaded an acoustic performance of Panicked at the Disco's This Is Gospel. It honestly wasn't Katsuki's first choice for favorite band, but 𝐬𝐻𝐬 had a way of making even the most annoying of songs sound amazing and worth listening to multiple times. At Deku sings "All with thanks. Glad you're done with your work day. Means you get to go home and relax now." At 𝐀𝐦 Yup. What are you up to? At Deku sings, just taking a quick break from studying. Figured I'd just say hey. So, hey, Katsuki let out a fond snort and rolled his eyes. What a dork. He actually hadn't been able to learn a whole lot of detail about 𝐬𝐻𝐬's life since leaving Shiksu and going to university, and for obvious reasons, he hadn't shared a lot of detail about his own life. At 𝐀𝐦 lol hey you eaten yet? There was way too long of a pause while Katsuki finished putting on his civilian attire and headed out the door, giving a quick goodbye to Ijiru who was taking night patrol this week. He knew exactly what that pause meant too. 𝐀𝐦 you haven't, have you? At Deku sings I might, just maybe, have forgotten to. Katsuki growled at his phone as he started walking the several blocks to his apartment. One thing was still the same as it had always been since the moment he'd met the frustrating nerd. At 𝐀EM0715. Damn it, Deku, you never take care of yourself. Put your damn books down and go get yourself some fucking food. At Deku sings but Kem, I still have a lot of studying to do. At 𝐀EM0715 now Deku, get some katsudon or something. He may not have been able to learn a lot of detail about 𝐬𝐻𝐬's life, but he still remembered his favorite food and had been glad to learn that it hadn't changed in all these years. At Deku sings okay, fine. You win, Kem. I'm putting on my shoes to go get food right now. Promise. At 𝐀EM0715 damn right. Then go back to your room and kick that homework's ass. At Deku sings he okay, Kem. I will. Katsuki smiled as he got into the elevator at his complex to head up to his floor. He could practically hear the nerd's stupid little giggle. They talked with as much frequency as their schedules allowed. But since as far as 𝐬𝐻𝐬 was concerned they were random internet strangers, they kept a lot of personal details out of their correspondence. On the one hand, Katsuki was relieved that he wouldn't have to reveal his now year-and-a-half-long deception, and he was proud of 𝐬𝐻𝐬 for practicing good internet behavior and not giving out his personal information to a stranger online. On the other hand, he really wanted to know more about 𝐬𝐻𝐬's life. Between their conversations, and what little life snippets 𝐬𝐻𝐬 let spill during his video intros and outros, he'd gathered that 𝐬𝐻𝐬 had gone to university after graduating from Shiksu, but he didn't know which university. He knew that he was double majoring and that at least one of his focuses involved a lot of statistics and analysis. Since he'd complained multiple times about some of his lessons, Katsuki didn't understand a word of it, but he was happy to be a sounding board for the Greenette's frustrations and venting. He knew that he missed his mother since he was living in the dorms at his school. He couldn't blame him. Everything he remembered about Auntie and Co. was warm, loving, and motherly. He knew the old hag still kept in touch with Auntie from time to time, but that was about it. He wished he knew more though. He wished he knew what 𝐬𝐻𝐬 was studying, where he lived, who his friends were, if he was seeing anyone since the breakup with Wind Bastard. He wished he could be there to hear the nerd's complaints about his classes in person, to give him a hug and make him a pot of tea before he dove back into his studies, to come home to after a long patrol, instead of the dark and empty apartment he was stepping into now. There was, of course, an easy way to try to make that happen, which was to come clean about who he was. He was way too scared to do that, though. Yup, one of the top 20 heroes in Japan, scared to correct a stupid little lie. Katsuki fucking Bakugo, able to take on the most terrifying of villains with nothing but rage and confidence coursing through his blood, scared about reversing a lie he'd been telling to his childhood friend and crush. He'd really wanted to tell him, to see if they could start talking on equal footing and work towards being friends again. Maybe even something more than friends, if he listened to the most hopeful part of his heart. But he kept chickening out about it every time he tried. And the longer he went without coming clean, the harder it was to do so. Seriously, how do you tell someone, oh, by the way, I've been lying about my identity for the last almost 2 years to you. I'm actually the guy who made your childhood hell. Surprise. So for now, he stuck to his obfuscations and his hidden identity. Honestly, it was something he needed. The only thing that kept him sane sometimes after a really tough week. Who was he kidding? He didn't really deserve to get comfort from Izuku. Not after their past, and certainly not after the way he's been tricking him for 2 years. 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐴0715. Just got home, gonna probably pass out here. Was a long day. Enjoy your food, and good luck with studies. Deku sings okie dokie. Good night, Chem, sleep tight. Smiling face with smiling eyes 𝐀𝐦0715. Yeah, you too, Deku. He powered off his phone and chucked it lightly down onto his nightstand before flopping down onto his bed. Sometimes he really felt like a piece of shit. Holy crap, I graduate next week. Hell yeah you do, Izuku. I'm so proud, fam. It was still hard for Izuku to wrap his head around sometimes. The last few years had been some of the most mentally and emotionally challenging of his life, but now he was graduating with a dual degree. He hadn't managed to hit the top of the class this time, but he was graduating with full honors, one of the few from his year to do so while pursuing 2 degrees simultaneously. He'd had to sacrifice almost his entire social life, but it would all be worth it if he could work his way up to being a hero analyst. Thanks, 𝐀𝐦. It's just all so surreal, you know. I've been working towards this for so long, and now it's finally here. He'd had pretty much no time to see his friends or his mother, outside the occasional weekend visit every few months. He did make more of an effort to call them, though, which is why he was on the phone now. You more than deserve it, Izuku. When it comes to kicking ass and being hella smart, you are totes the GOAT. You got any big shot job offers lined up yet? He chuckled at her enthusiasm. Nothing concrete yet. I have a few feelers out to various agencies. But realistically, no hero agency is gonna even look at a new grad that doesn't have a super impressive analysis quirk, much less no quirk at all. Most likely, I'll end up in some kind of non-hero analysis role, probably finance or something, for a bit. That's lame, so done with that quirkist bullshit. You know me or any of our other hero friends would give you recommendations in a heartbeat, right? I know. This may sound dumb, but I don't want to get there that way. I want to know I earned it completely on my own merits, and if that means I take the long and arduous path, then so be it. Live your best life, Izuku. Just don't forget that you've got a bunch of friends who will help you in a heartbeat. He couldn't stop himself from a wide smile at that. Even though it had been years since his friendless days in middle school, it was sometimes still hard to believe that he had so many good friends and people who cared about him. Thanks, 𝐀𝐦. Listen, I should give my mom a call. Haven't talked to her in a little while, but I'll catch you later. Totes, fam. At minimum, I am definitely gonna be at your graduation this time. Why agency tries to send me out of the country again, I'm gonna just burn the building down. Izuku laughed, only the tiniest bit unsure how much she was kidding. Please don't do that, 𝐀𝐦. I'm sure you'll be able to come and I'm really looking forward to it. I won't. Alright, tell your mom I said hi. Catch you later, Izuku. I will. Bye. Izuku ended the call with a smile and stretched in his chair. He'd ended up staying at the dorms his entire school career, not wanting to add any extra financial strain to his mom than he already was. It wasn't the most comfortable way to live, but it wasn't like he cooked or entertained guests, so what good would a kitchen or living room do him? He'd had a bed, a desk, and a chair. All he really needed, settling down into a comfy position. He pulled his phone back up and dialed his mother. She answered on the first ring. Izuku. Hi, Mom. How are you? Oh, you know me. Just moving along. Better now that my son has finally found time to give his poor old mother a call. He knew she was teasing, though he still felt just the tiniest bit guilty. I know, Mom, I'm sorry. The last few weeks were crazy with final exams and projects. Oh, sweetie, I know. I was only teasing you. But now you're all done and you graduate next week. I'm so incredibly proud of you, Izuku. The tears could already be heard starting to well up in her voice. Oh, Mom, don't cry. You know you crying just makes me cry. She sniffed and took a deep breath to steady her emotions. I know, sweetie. I'm just proud of my only son growing up into a fine young man, going to university, and getting 2 degrees. You've done so well, and I'm sure you're going to go on to do so much more. Thanks, Mom. And thank you for supporting me through all of this. I know it isn't easy working to pay off my tuition and stuff. Oh shush, Izuku. I'd do it all over again. I'm happy to support you in your dreams. To be honest, I felt pretty bad for a long while about something I'd told you when you were little. There was something you needed me to say, a way you needed me to support you, and I failed you in that moment. So I'm more than happy to do anything I can to support you for the rest of my life. Okay, now Izuku really was crying. Mom, thank you. And I want you to know, I never thought that you'd failed me. Ever. I'm so lucky to have had you in my corner all this time. I truly don't know what I would have done without you. She chuckled lightly, but he could hear the tears in her voice now too. I've always thought I was the lucky one to have a son like you. There was a brief pause where neither of them said anything, just letting the sweet moment hang between them on the phone. But it was suddenly interrupted by his mother letting out a small wince of pain. Mom, are you okay? Oh, I'm fine, sweetie. Just my shoulder acting up a bit, and I've been feeling a little lightheaded today, but it's nothing, I promise. I'm just a little tired. That's all. He wasn't entirely placated by that statement, being the worrier that he was, but he let it slide. Okay, Mom, just try to take it easy and get some rest. All right, I will, Izuku. I'll go take a nap as soon as we're off the phone before heading into my shift this evening. Okay, good. And also promise me something. As soon as I'm graduated, and we've made the last tuition payment, you're going on a nice vacation somewhere. I want you to relax and unwind for a good long while, okay? Okay, Izuku, I promise. That sounds really lovely. He could hear the smile in her voice, matched almost by his own. All right, Mom, go take that nap. I'll talk to you later, okay? I love you. I love you too, sweetie. I'll talk to you soon. They ended the call there and he smiled out the window, watching the birds flit by. He really was far too lucky to have his mom in his life. It was weird not having to spend his evenings studying or doing homework. He almost didn't know what to do with himself. After getting off the phone with his mom, he'd spent a few hours watching anime, something he hadn't done almost since starting at university. He'd tried shooting a message to Kem, but didn't get a reply, which almost always meant that the other was working or otherwise preoccupied. Having handled all the binge watching he could, he was now scrolling through his news feeds, but it had apparently been a slow day and nothing much had happened. He was about to call it quits and just go to sleep early for once in his life, but then his phone buzzed in his hand. At 𝐀𝐦 𝐍𝐸 Deku. At Deku sings Hey Kem. Just get off work. At 𝐀𝐦 Yup. It was a fucking rough one, too. At Deku sings Awa. Super busy. At 𝐀𝐦 exactly the opposite. Fucking nothing happened. I hate when nothing happens. It's super fucking boring. And honestly it puts me on edge, like something is happening and I've just missed it. At Deku sings Oof. Yeah, I get it. Honestly felt kinda like that today. Kept having this knot in my stomach like I was forgetting some paper or exam I should have been studying for. At 𝐀𝐦 Oh shit. That's right. You graduate next week, right? Congrats. At Deku sings Thanks. Yeah, next week. Been telling all my friends, it just feels so surreal. Not gonna be a student anymore. Gonna have to actually join the workforce. At 𝐀𝐦 Well, whatever you're gonna do, I'm sure you're gonna fucking kill it, Deku. At Deku sings Thanks, Kem. That means a lot. Smiling face at 𝐀𝐦 Of course. So, what did you do today then, now that you have no obligations for a bit? At Deku sings Oh, I did something I haven't gotten to do in forever. I binge watched some anime. At 𝐀𝐦 Oh yeah, did you finally give Blue Exorcist a try? At Deku sings Haha, no not yet, sorry. I watched that one about the ice skaters in a world without quirks. It was super sweet and romantic. At 𝐀𝐦 Oh yeah, a few friends have recommended that one to me a few times. Not sure it's my thing, though. Wait, this was your first time watching that one? At Deku sings Yeah. Why? At 𝐀𝐦 You're such a musical dork. You sang the theme song to it like 4 years ago, but you're just now getting around to watching it. Leave it to you to do the song of an anime several years before watching the anime itself. At Deku sings Don't Judge Me. At 𝐀𝐦 Humi. I would never. Smiling face with horns. They spent the next hour like that, just chatting away like they always did. They discussed anime, video games, some of Izuku's final exams, Izuku's latest video, anything and everything. Izuku still didn't know who Kem really was, but he really felt like he knew him. Maybe that was a weird distinction, but it still made sense to him. He felt like a bit of a creep, but he maybe was starting to get a bit of a crush on his mysterious internet friend, the one who always made time to talk to him, who defended him like a wild dog in the comments of his videos. It was silly to crush on someone you'd never seen or met, but still, crushing is exactly what Izuku seemed to be doing. There was a bit of a lull in their back and forth before Kem finally sent another message. At 𝐀𝐦 Hey, Deku. There's something I should probably tell you. What the heck did that mean? It sounded super ominous. Izuku's overanalyzing brain was starting to build up into overdrive, thinking about the implications of what Kem could be talking about. He was just about to reply when he was suddenly startled by his phone starting to buzz in his hand with a phone call. HM, that's weird. Don't recognize the number. Wonder who it is. He slid to answer the call and held the phone to his ear. Hello. The voice on the other end was a masculine yet somehow comforting voice. Hello, is this Izuku Midoriya? Izuku tilted his head in confusion. He wasn't expecting any calls. Yes, this is he. Who may I ask is calling? Good evening, Mr. Midoriya. This is Dr. Takahashi at Kyoto General Hospital. I'm afraid I have some bad news. His mind began to race immediately. A doctor. Bad news. Kyoto General. Izuku had never been there before, but it wasn't terribly far from where 𝐶𝐻 was. Someone he knew must have gotten hurt or something. He didn't think he was anyone's emergency contact, though, except for his mom. Izuku's heart fell into his stomach, and he found his mouth had gone so dry as to leave him speechless with fear. Not hearing any response, the doctor continued, I'm afraid your mother 𝐀𝐻 has suffered a massive heart attack. He felt like the floor was falling out from under him, but this news shocked his brain and mouth back into action. What happened? Is she okay? What's her condition? Where is she? They're at Kyoto General. I'm in Tokyo, so I can get there in just a few hours if I take the bullet train. What room? Dr. Takahashi cut him off with a forceful yet gentle tone. Mr. Midoriya, please take a deep breath. He paused for a moment while Izuku did so. I'm very sorry to have to tell you this, but I'm afraid your mother didn't make it. She was brought in critical condition and we did everything we could to stabilize her, but the damage to her heart was too severe. There was nothing we could do. And just like that, Izuku's world crumbled to pieces.